Imagine just transferring to your dream college, right in the heart of a bustling city. There's always something happening. Grabbing coffee, studying in the library, hitting the gym, or going out with friends. For one young woman, it was the first week of classes. She joined her friends for Wild Wednesday to celebrate a 21st birthday, partying until the bars closed. But by the next morning, she had vanished. The only clue left behind was a desperate text pleading for help. This is her story. Today's case is about a bright, hilarious, and outspoken university student named Jenna Nicole Burley, who was always unapologetically herself. Jenna was born on November 4, 1994 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the actual state capital. Her parents are Joseph Edward Burley, who went by Ed, and Jacqueline Burley, who went by Jackie. Jackie and Ed both went to college at Villanova University in Philadelphia. Jackie loved to joke that she was going to Villanova to meet and marry a rich man, but over the years as she matured, she became more concerned with getting a good education than meeting men. She eventually crossed paths with her future husband, Ed, who swept her off her feet. It turns out Ed wasn't rich, but he was exactly Jackie's type, and just as passionate about taking care of others. They were truly a perfect match. Jackie went into hospice care, and Ed did nursing and rehabilitation. They got married on October 26, 1991, and just a year later they had their first daughter, Janelle. 3 years later, they welcomed Jenna. Here are some pictures. She was a very cute and happy baby. Jenna was part of a large Catholic family. She had 13 aunts and uncles, 13 cousins, and 2 younger brothers named Jeb and Jacob. I couldn't help but notice that all the children have J names, like their mother. The Burley family enjoyed taking trips to visit their extended family in California and Avalon, New Jersey. But their home base was at their house located at 346 Coddington Way in Harleysville, Pennsylvania, a suburb on the far outskirts of Philadelphia. It's on the far end of a circular road in a charming neighborhood with lots of pretty homes and spacious yards. It's a 4-bedroom, 2.5-bath home, close to 3,500 square feet, perfect for a family like Jenna's. When they weren't traveling, the family loved hanging out at home with their dogs, Jay and Coda. Growing up, Jenna was a dog lover, an animal lover, and as girly as can be. She loved dressing up, wearing pink, and playing with dolls. Dramatic should have been Jenna's middle name because no matter what she was doing, she was the star of the show. You could tell she was going places because of her quick wit and extroverted personality. On the very first day of kindergarten, Jenna met another little girl named Tori Tornetta. Tori had a little accident and had to go to the nurse's office for a change of clothes, which gave Jenna an idea. Jenna decided she wasn't wearing an outfit she loved, so she too had an accident and followed Tori to the nurse's office so that she could get a better outfit from home. From then on, they were best friends. Jenna was known for her expressive fashion statements throughout middle and high school. At first, she tried to blend in, as most of us do. She wore Hollister, Abercrombie, and American Eagle, with the classic emo haircut, and secretly listened to Panic at the Disco when she got home, all while trying to maintain that preppy image. But at Soderton High, Jenna's fashion started to reflect her true personality. She wore sparkly rainbow outfits, glittery makeup, graphic tees, tie-dye, kitty ears, chokers, faux fur, heart-shaped sunglasses, crocheted crop tops, and dark lipstick. Jenna's style could be described as camp, over-the-top, exaggerated, and in your face. Her inspiration was hippie music festivals and emo nights, and she pushed her friends to their fashion limits as well. Jenna thought it would be cool to go into fashion as a career, but she was hyper-aware of environmental sustainability and the problems within the modeling industry, so the fashion path didn't make sense for her life goals. Jenna wanted to make a difference in the world and uplift voices that might not have the privilege to be heard. So she joined her high school's film production team, Red Alert, where she made short skits and documentaries. Her talent in filmmaking was obvious. She was creative and passionate. In 2011, Jenna joined Facebook, and I have to say, there are a number of selfies with the duck face and the peace sign. Her bio read, "Millennial Alien Baby," and her workplace said, "Your butt," so you can tell she definitely had a sense of humor. I also noticed she loved to change her hair color. It appeared to be naturally dark, but she rocked blonde and even pink hair. You can also tell from her interactions on her page that Jenna had a lot of great friends. She was quirky, funny, compassionate, and positive, and did everything in her power not to conform to society's standards. Social media was a place where she could speak her mind on every topic because nothing was off limits. She would share her thoughts on anything, from love to self-harm to being whoever you want to be in life, and not letting society dictate your path. In 2013, Jenna posted a picture with her little cousin and said, "I just want to steal her one day and go shopping." Kids actually really loved Jenna, not only because she wore really flashy and cute outfits, but also because of her childlike enthusiasm. She carried that same enthusiasm throughout her college visits and graduation. She even posted pictures in her white cap and gown with her friends, Aaron, Reagan, and their favorite teacher at graduation. She also joked about a post she shared about two women who were friends for 100 years, saying that was going to be her and her best friend Tori. Friends also started to comment about how meaningful the things Jenna shared were, especially when she began posting on her own blog. She often shared pictures or short excerpts from her journal, and one friend commented that she was already saying a lot of meaningful things that many people could relate to, noting that it doesn't have to be a novel. Sometimes short and sweet are best. In August of 2013, the summer after graduation, Jenna made the decision to relocate for college to sunny Florida, my home state. Jenna was accepted into the University of Tampa, where she participated in sorority recruitment and joined Kappa Alpha Theta. She took classes in film and media studies. She went there to escape. Jenna wasn't sure if college was even right for her, but she wanted to spread her wings and explore. She went home for Christmas that year, still feeling great about her decision to go to Tampa, as Harleyville was experiencing heavy snowstorms, referred to as Snowmageddon at the time. Sadly, the black ice was horrible. Jenna had a terrible accident, slipping and shattering her ankle. They had to insert screws and plates, and she had to go to physical therapy to learn how to walk again. This was what Jenna's summer looked like. After the surgery, Jenna had a small chance, around 0.1% of getting an infection. Since it was highly unlikely, she decided to return to sunny Tampa and tough it out. The semester started, and against all odds, Jenna was among that small percentage to get an infection. At the ER, she was given an IV drip and a wheelchair. Ed and Jackie suggested Jenna come back home and take a semester off so they could help her out, and I understand how hard that must have been for a parent, not being there for their child. Jenna's accident completely changed her life. She leaned on her family and friends more than ever before. She started therapy, but it didn't ease the fact that at 19, she couldn't do the things other people her age were doing. She couldn't go out with friends, show off her outfits, or have fun. And that spring was when she really turned to blogging. The title of her website was Seeking a Great Perhaps, which I like because it's sort of about having lower expectations with the word perhaps. Maybe she would find whatever she was looking for, but sadly, that would become more of a reality than she could have probably imagined. She posted 42 blog posts in 2014, and in those posts she talked about body image, perfectionism, mental health, student debt, sex, and positivity. She was very vocal about women and how they should stand up for what they believe in. For example, she believed women should be allowed to breastfeed in public without stigma, and she wanted to destroy rape culture. It says, "Why does my dad tell me it's different for a girl every single effing time I go out?" Now, I can't say the R word again and again, so I'm going to substitute it with forced intercourse. If you're not sure what is meant by R-word culture, let me read you an excerpt from Jenna's blog on the topic from May 2014. It says, "Why does my dad tell me it's different for a girl every single effing time I go out? Because hello, the only reason it's different for a girl is because people keep saying it's different for a girl. You can't get too drunk because you're a girl, and then someone could force you into intercourse. That's the reason. Does no one realize what you're telling girls? You're telling girls they can't have fun the way guys do, because guys will take advantage of them. You know what would be better to do? Teach boys that it's not effing okay to sexually harm girls. You're teaching little girls that it's their fault if a guy forces them into any type of sexual situation because of what they're wearing or what they're doing. And then she says sarcastically, if they were wearing a short skirt or were drunk, obviously it's their fault that it happened. People seriously put that into consideration like it's an okay way to think. Why in the effing world is it even a little bit okay for a girl to be harmed because of something she was doing wrong? End quote. This is clearly something Jenna was very passionate about. Jenna cared, and reading her work, I feel like she's speaking to every young girl out there, and speaking loudly. She was a very talented writer, and though I don't agree with every position she held, it's clear she thought deeply about the world and her place in it, and that's something I can get on board with. In April of 2015, Jenna posted on Facebook that SeaWorld should be disbanded because animals should not be enslaved for human entertainment. In June of 2015, when gay marriage was legalized in the United States, she posted this picture, you've probably seen it before, of Joe Biden and Barack Obama running in the White House holding rainbow flags. Jenna was outspoken about LGBTQ+ rights and equality. She loved people and wanted it to be known that whoever you were, she would accept you. She wasn't going to try to change anyone just because they might be different from her. At this time, she was also watching the show Orange is the New Black, and she posted on her blog that she wasn't into labels, which is a testament to Jenna's maturity and her free spirit. While recovering from her infection, Jenna actually opened up an Etsy shop for her tie-dye projects and expanded it into homemade necklaces. 20% of the sales she made went to her favorite charity, the Happy Hippie Foundation, a charity run by Miley Cyrus that aims to help LGBTQ+ kids who experience homelessness. Jenna had always been so grateful to her family for supporting and loving her no matter what, and she wanted to extend that same type of love and support to others. Jenna truly had a heart for those without a place to call home, so she made it one of her biggest missions to help the homeless. But Jenna could still accept help from others as well. For example, the day after Christmas in 2014, a whole year after the accident, Jenna went to her mother Jackie and said she needed help. What she meant was that her mental health had declined and she was in a depressive episode. Her mother heard her and helped her. She helped Jenna go to a mental health facility. She was so proud of her daughter for getting help and being so transparent to all of her friends and extended family members. Jenna had visitors while she stayed with the nurses, and she blogged about her battle with depression, anxiety, ADHD, and what doctors later suggested could be bipolar disorder. Jenna said that her thoughts had turned evil and dark, and that, it happens to a lot of people, so I'm not afraid to admit it, end quote. And that's brave, since sadly there is still a stigma around mental health and not being seen as normal, when truly, we all have dark moments in life. In February of 2015, Jenna got a much-needed vacation. She flew to the West Coast with her dad Ed and her uncle Chip. On Facebook, with this picture, she called them her favorite drinking buddies and probably the best worst influences. You can tell how close she was with her father. They definitely had a special bond. After that trip, Jenna had the travel bug. She wanted to go everywhere and do everything. Her parents talked about her going back to college to take the next step in her documentary career. So Jenna decided this time she would stay close to home and enrolled in Montgomery County Community College, which was only about a 20-minute drive from her parents' house. Jenna ended up getting her associate's degree there, and from 2015 to 2016, Jenna hung out with all of her friends, Ally, Becca, Aaron, Tori, Danielle, Jesse, and so many others. She loved going to music festivals and went to the Philadelphia Folk Festival several years in a row, and one day she really wanted to attend Coachella. Jenna loved, in no particular order, Lana Del Rey, Bernie Sanders, Sylvia Plath, cheese, wine, Disney movies, dancing on tables, and using Snapchat filters. She constantly loved changing her look, as I mentioned, and dyed her hair pink, platinum blonde, and all shades of brunette. All the while, she advocated for what she believed in: anti-racism, feminism, affordable housing, and of course, combating homelessness. In December of 2015, Jenna posted this quote on Facebook. "It's winter apparently, so I'm going to assume it'll eventually get super cold, which no one enjoys. But all of us are fortunate enough to have everything we need, even if it's not everything we want. It makes my soul sad that there are people who have nothing. They are forced to live in the cold, and then we wonder why their hearts are so icy. Not all homeless people fall under the stereotype society has given them. It's important to realize we are all living in our own realities. We all have a story that has formed us into the person that we are and has directed us to the place we're at in life. So instead of pretending I cared like I always have, I'm going to finally prove I do, which we all should. What I want to do this winter is make backpacks called blessing bags for the local homeless people in Philly. I've seen people do this, and I think it's the least I can do. That being said, if any of you have any winter essentials to donate, food, toiletries, gift cards, etc., I'd be happy to take them off your hands. I plan to go to Goodwill and other thrift stores to get things as well, but I figured I'd use this site for something actually important. I'll attach a list I found online of what others have included, but any suggestions are welcome. This list doesn't include coats or blankets, which I also want to add. So if you're feeling generous, either comment or message me with anything and everything you can give. Let's start loving, helping, and supporting those less fortunate than us, instead of depreciating and disregarding them just because it's easier. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. Underneath, she did post an organized checklist, and Jenna's blessing bags were born. Jenna assembled the backpacks on her own and then drove an hour to downtown Philadelphia to hand them out to strangers. In 2016, Jenna posted a selfie featuring the pink, yellow, and blue pansexual flag with the words, "I do not have sex with pans," end quote. She'd recently found out that there was a label that encompassed her sexuality. When she cared about someone, she cared about them, regardless of how they labeled themselves. Jenna said that she'd grown. She thought labels weren't for her until she learned that there was a label for her. If you're not familiar, because I wasn't fully aware of what this meant, pansexuality is a sexual orientation that describes romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction to people of any gender identity. The prefix pan just means all, and I've actually heard this referred to as being sexually fluid, which ultimately means that you look for the qualities that attract you, and regardless of the gender of the person, you fall in love with them for who they are. And in January of 2017, Jenna posted that she was still growing, but for the first time ever, she finally felt like she was headed in the right direction. She'd gone to a women's march on National Women's Day, and Jenna said the march empowered her. Now she felt like she understood her femininity. It was what made her strong. Jenna said, "I know people feel alone and hurt and scared because I feel it too. Even with my white privilege constantly stapled to my face, I feel it, and I will always fight for what's right. I will fight for intersectional feminism because the whitewashing has to stop. I will always fight for equality for all, and my journey is just getting started." It's clear that Jenna is a very outspoken and strong woman. As I stated from the beginning, Jenna loved people and wanted to be as accepting as she could. She was the type of person who wouldn't let anyone talk badly about someone else. If she heard someone bullying someone, she would step in and tell them it was messed up, and then tell them to accept that person for who they are. We're all different. In the fall of 2017, Jenna finally had enough credits to transfer to a 4-year university. She did think about going back to Tampa, but it just wouldn't be the same. Besides, she had friends that were now going to college in Philly, so Jenna committed to Temple University. She was a junior at this point, majoring in film and media studies, and she did choose to live with her parents during this transition. She redecorated her room, she painted the walls teal, and she hung up new pictures and motivational quotes, so it kind of felt like she was in a dorm of her own. Jenna commuted the hour to attend classes in downtown Philadelphia. When Jenna wasn't in class or at home, she worked at a retail job and occasionally slept over at friends' apartments so she wouldn't have to drive all the way back to her parents' house. Now, Temple University had a very big social scene. It's right smack dab in the middle of downtown Philadelphia, surrounded by bars with lots to do. When you're in the Temple bubble, you feel safe, but stepping right outside the campus in Philadelphia is one of the highest crime rates in the United States. Crossing that threshold is like night and day. However, students felt safe hanging out around town, especially if there were locations that many students frequented. Unfortunately, during her first week of classes, Jenna had another accident. This time it was in her car, but she was lucky. The damage was minor. She called her dad, and Ed drove to Temple to help Jenna deal with getting the car towed and all that stuff. Now the car would have to be at the shop overnight. That was on Wednesday, August 30th, and the next day, on Thursday, Jenna did have a very early class, but now she didn't have a way to get to school the next morning, and she wanted to attend that class. So she told her dad, "You know what? Don't worry about taking me back home. I'm just going to crash on my friend Davis's couch." She had plans to meet her friend Davis Tren and his friends for a mutual friend's 21st birthday party that night. It was the infamous Wild Wednesday, which is a Temple University student tradition. It was Jenna's first Wednesday on campus. She wasn't going to miss it. Now, I wasn't sure whether this was a weekly tradition where students went out on Wednesday nights to kind of celebrate hump day in the middle of the week, or if it was just the first Wednesday when classes start for a particular semester. But when I looked into it, it appeared to be a weekly thing for students at Temple University. It includes bar hopping after classes up and down the streets surrounding the school, lots of drinking, and lots of partying, which is pretty normal for most college cultures. That Wednesday evening, Jenna's dad took her out for dinner, and they had such a good time. Before he left her home, he gave her a big hug and kiss and offered to drop her off at Davis's house. But Jenna said Davis was already out having fun, and she was just going to meet up with him down the street. They said their goodbyes, and she walked away. She turned the corner of the building, and Ed thought about how proud he was of his daughter as he watched her go. Jenna, Davis, and a few of their friends went bar hopping for a few hours. They kept running into another group of Jenna's friends, which included her friend Danielle. Jenna's night ended at a place called Pub Web. It's a sports bar on a road called Silmare Avenue, which is only about a block away from the campus. It looks like a typical bar, with a long skinny counter and a large selection of alcohol. In the back of the bar, there are some tables you can sit at where drunk people usually get brave enough to sing karaoke up on a small stage. And if you're hungry, they do offer burgers and wings to eat. It's a very small bar, and it gets really crowded with all the students piling in. Let me tell you what Jenna and her friends were doing that night. While her friend Davis, who she met up with, only had one drink that night, just before midnight he left. He told Jenna to text him when she was ready to come back to his place, where she was supposed to be staying that night. Jenna stayed out since Danielle's group had shown up, and they just partied and partied until past 1 a.m. Now, the bars closed at 2 o'clock, and this particular one started to clear out closer to closing time. One by one, Jenna's friends began to leave, and somehow there was a mix-up regarding who was taking Jenna to Davis's. But before she knew it, everyone she knew was gone. Jenna was sitting there at an empty bar, just finishing up her drink and texting Davis to figure out what she was supposed to do after 2 a.m. Davis woke up and he hadn't even meant to fall asleep, so he was scrambling for his phone. Jenna had called and texted him. In one of her messages, she asked if Davis was awake and if she could come over. In another, she asked for help, and that freaked him out. Why would Jenna need help? He texted back, but Jenna never replied. So Davis's anxiety kept him wide awake. He called Jenna back over and over again, but she didn't answer. Then he started calling their mutual friends, hoping that she had found someone else to spend the night with. Not everyone was awake at this time in the middle of the night, but there were a few friends who were awake, and they didn't know where Jenna had gone after they parted ways. By 8 a.m., when Davis still hadn't been able to get a hold of Jenna, he amassed a search group of Jenna's friends to scour Temple University's campus, hoping that she'd made it to class that morning. You don't want to think the worst, and most times you don't. But at first, Jenna's friends just expected her to get in touch with them sometime that day, and maybe share a crazy story of the night before. Jenna's friend Jesse got a call from one of Jenna's friends asking if he knew where Jenna was. Jesse didn't, so he got in touch with Danielle, and Danielle started looking around for Jenna. She was shocked that Jenna had pretty much been abandoned at the bar. Then it hit her. Where was she now? Was she still asleep? Had her phone died? Was she even okay, or was she in some kind of danger? The anxiety was beginning to build because, as much as everyone hoped Jenna would be fine, remember that outside of campus, the streets of Philadelphia are not exactly the safest place, especially for a woman to be all alone. Jesse called Jenna's mom, Jackie. She picked up at work, thinking Jenna's phone was probably dead, and maybe she was calling from Jesse's phone. When Jackie answered, Jesse said, "Jenna's with you, right?" And at that exact moment, Jackie knew that something was wrong. Jenna was one of those people who always texted and called when she changed locations. She didn't want anyone to worry about her. Jesse told Jackie that she and Ed needed to come to Temple immediately because Jenna was nowhere to be found. This is a parent's worst nightmare, and we already know that Jenna's father had warned her about something happening to women when they go out partying. Even though Jenna fought to break the stereotype that it was a woman's job to make sure that she didn't invite bad behavior from men, not hearing from Jenna would be a living nightmare. Jackie called Ed at work and said their daughter was missing. Ed went into dad mode. He picked up Jackie, and they sped down the freeway, not wanting his wife to drive because she was worried sick. At this point, Jenna's parents met with the Temple University Police Department. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, August 31st, 2017, and recall it is the first week of school. The officers told Ed and Jackie there was no cause to be concerned, that this happened all the time. Students are free from their parents, they go out, they go on a bender, and they wake up at 2 p.m. the next day with a massive hangover and a wild story to tell. Well, Ed and Jackie insisted this was unlike Jenna, and we hear that a lot. It makes sense that we do, because if this was normal for someone, then no one would be worried. It's true that this was Jenna's first week at Temple, but she wasn't the age of most incoming students. She wasn't 18 or even a freshman at all, she was 22. She was responsible, and she had already done a lot of partying. This wasn't exactly new to her. The security department agreed to look up Jenna's student card in their system, which would show that Jenna never swiped into the university after the bar was closed at 2 a.m. If Jenna did stay at someone's place, they didn't live in a residence hall. Then again, couldn't they have opened the door for her? There were just so many questions about where she could be. An officer actually went to Jenna's midday class and waited outside. When the students and professor filed out of the room, the officer showed a picture of Jenna to each and every one, asking if they had seen her. The answer was no. She hadn't been at any of her classes. Jenna wasn't on campus, and when they called local hospitals, the few Jane Does did not fit Jenna's description. The Temple police helped Ed and Jackie fill out a missing persons report, getting as much information as possible about what Jenna looked like, what she'd been doing the night before, and when she vanished. Ed said that at dinner, Jenna was wearing an oversized light blue sweatshirt. Jenna's friend said Jenna had that sweatshirt tied around her waist during the night, and she was wearing a navy blue, ripped pair of jeans, brown boots, a white t-shirt with the words "Positive Vibes Only" on it, and her hair was up in pigtails. Now that would be a very distinctive characteristic. It's easier to spot than hair just being down, for example. Captain Edward Walmate was assigned to the case. He had been working at Temple University for a decade. He learned Jenna was last seen by friends at the bars, which were not technically Temple's jurisdiction, so the Philadelphia police and the Lower Salford PD out of Harleysville were roped into this case. Jenna's friend David showed investigators Jenna's texts before 2 a.m. asking for help. They also learned Jenna had messaged another friend before 2 a.m. via Instagram DM. She asked to stay the night, and then she asked for help, but that friend was asleep. Detective Taryn Sweeney of the Philadelphia Police Department knew that time was of the essence, and he requested Jenna's CSLI. Now this stands for Cell Site Location Information from her provider. Unfortunately, the last place Jenna went before her phone was turned off was PubWeb at 2 a.m. on August 31st. It seemed like her phone never left the bar. So what happened? Was she still there? Did she pass out somewhere outside of the bar? So, of course, officers raced to PubWeb as soon as it opened at 3 p.m. Man asked the employees if they worked the night before. One of them had and recognized Jenna's picture, her hairstyle, the middle part with the two high pigtails. It made her stand out from the crowd. The manager let the police look at surveillance footage, and sure enough, they spotted Jenna. Later, they saw Jenna sitting at the bar until it closed. She's in a center seat, finishing a drink and texting her friends about needing a place to stay. As we know at this point, it's about 1:30 in the morning. The bar is empty. Jenna does make a frustrated gesture to her phone because we know that no one's answering, and that's gotta be frustrating, especially when someone's been drinking. It's harder to make sense of things and make decisions then. In the footage, you see a man approaching her from the right around 1:38 a.m. He kind of leans over and whispers something to her, and then he sits right next to Jenna, even though the entire bar is empty. He could have sat anywhere. Then he seems to buy Jenna a drink. She does engage with him. It appears as though they're having a conversation even though it's brief. But Jenna keeps looking at her phone, and we know why. She's trying to get in touch with friends so she can get to bed and to class in a few hours. Then the lights in the bar turn on. It's now 2 a.m. and it's time to leave. The man leads the way out and Jenna follows behind him. They're walking outside side by side, with only a few feet between them, and they head northwest around the corner and across the street. Both of them are pretty intoxicated. Outwardly, you can tell this, but they are sober enough that they don't need support when they're walking. However, they're not exactly walking in straight lines, which makes sense. They just came from a bar and were drinking. But that's all the footage investigators have at this point. So they asked the bartender if Jenna seemed uncomfortable at all, and they said no. Jenna's body language seemed open. Plus, the bartender says he knows the man that she left with. He's a regular at PubWeb. His name is Joshua Huerter, and one of the bartenders even had Joshua's phone number. That was perfect. Maybe he saw which way she was headed or happened to help her get to a friend's place. So Captain Walmate placed a call to Joshua's cell phone around 5:15 p.m., but he doesn't end up picking up at that time. So Wall tells Ed and Jackie that they've got a lead. Jenna was seen leaving a bar with a man, and law enforcement was in the process of figuring out where this guy lived so they could gather more information. Ed and Jackie began to wonder who this guy was, because, at this point, they didn't know if he was older, if he was a fellow student, and whether Jenna went anywhere else with him after the bar. They wondered if she would have gone somewhere willingly, or if he ended up taking advantage of her. It was a lot to take in. In the meantime, they went into nearby hospitals hoping to find Jenna, without any luck. Ed had a bad feeling. Of course he did, because we know how he feels about men and about women going out and drinking. They were rapidly approaching the 24-hour mark at this point, and it scared him. At 11:15 p.m. that night, Walm finally got a call back from Joshua. He apologized for not calling back sooner. He had gone out that night before and had been napping most of the day because he was sleeping off a hangover. Joshua said that he didn't know a Jenna Burley, and I mean, we don't know if they even exchanged names. They weren't at the bar very long before they were seen walking out, but he did say he had gone out with his roommate that night, and by midnight, he had had a lot to drink. He was pretty much blackout drunk at the end of the night. Joshua said he purchased and drank about $200 worth of alcohol. He was definitely binging that night. That's a lot of alcohol. Walmate struggled to believe that Joshua could even drink this and remain standing, but he figured Joshua probably lost count, or he could be exaggerating, or he bought other people drinks, because we saw him buy one, possibly for Jenna. It's not that hard, as the price racks up when you're spending it on drinks. Walmate told Joshua he wanted to interview him the next morning since he had been caught on CCTV walking out of PubWeb with Jenna, and he might be the last person to have seen her before she disappeared. So Joshua gave his address. Walmate wrote it down, and he promised to see him in the morning. The next morning, on September 1st, Walmate heads to Joshua's apartment, and he realizes it was really close to PubWeb. It's only a few minutes south, but that was interesting because the CCTV footage showed that Joshua and Jenna were seen walking in a northwestern direction. So where were they headed? Walmate stood outside Joshua's apartment and called him, and once again, Joshua didn't answer. So Wall left him a voicemail saying, "Hey Joshua, this is Captain Wallmate again from Temple Police. We spoke last night. Could you call me back as soon as you get this? We're basically down on your block and we would like to talk to you, so please call me back." Since Joshua wasn't calling right back, Wallmate and Detective Nicholas Tula canvassed the apartment, hoping that someone knew where Joshua lived. They showed his neighbors a picture of him from his file, and no one recognized Joshua. Wallmate was shocked. He did some digging because, remember, he was a local. He was a regular at PubWeb, so people ended up telling him that Joshua actually lived at 1708 North 16th Street, not 1608. So he was one digit off. He wondered, did Joshua lie about his address, or did Wallmate hear him wrong and write it down incorrectly? Either way, 1708 was a 3-minute walk north, and only a minute walk away from PubWeb, actually less than a minute. All you had to do was turn the corner, cross the street, and you would be at Joshua's apartment. If you're looking at the screen, it's right around this corner. So, Wallmate canvassed that building, which many students from Temple lived in. Neighbors told him that Joshua lived in apartment 1R. When you come in through the main door of the building, 1R is straight ahead on the first floor. It's a 4-bedroom, 3-bath apartment that has bedrooms on the main and basement levels. They knocked on the front door, but they got no response. Without a key to get in, officers didn't really want to do something drastic like break down the door if they didn't have to, since Joshua didn't live alone, and they didn't want to do anything without knowing more details. But they knew they needed to get in somehow, because they wanted to check for both Joshua and possibly Jenna, or if anyone had seen her. Outside the complex was a for rent sign with a phone number on it for the landlord, so they gave him a call. The landlord arrived and used the key to open the door. Now I know what many of you might be thinking. Don't they need a search warrant? Technically yes, but Wallmate had already checked the common areas of the complex, hoping he could find Jenna or signs of her or a tenant from that unit somewhere on the premises. However, if they have probable belief that someone is in danger and could be inside a building, they can enter under what's known legally as exigent circumstances. Because what if Jenna was inside and possibly hurt or suffering from something like alcohol poisoning? There was enough probable cause that Jenna needed medical help and they could enter the home. When you walk in, there's a kitchen area, a living room, a small bathroom, and a door to the backyard area, as well as a rear bedroom. Then down on the basement level, there are 3 other bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Wallmate made his way around. It wasn't exactly tidy. There were things all over, which is typical for college-age people. The table was covered in papers, a hat, a wine bottle, a sports drink bottle, and all kinds of miscellaneous items. There were also things all over the floor: shoes, a plastic bowl, and shoe boxes. So he looked in the main level bathroom, all 4 bedrooms, and closets to see if Jenna was there, but she wasn't. No one was home, but Wallmate and Tula noticed 2 things: a pair of men's Jordan sandals with what appeared to be a bit of blood on the heel area, and a toilet paper roll with blood on it as well, or what looked like blood. They didn't have to search through anything to see these items. They were right out in the open and very concerning. After the detectives left, they applied for a search warrant, and since Joshua still wasn't answering his cell phone, they were able to get his cell phone data without a warrant. Now, the warrant process for cell phone records usually takes a week minimum, sometimes a month, and they didn't have much time to lose. Not when Jenna's life could be in jeopardy. If they could track Joshua down as he moved between cell towers, they could pin him down and finally get him in for an interview, because that's all they wanted at this point. But I'm sure by this time word was out that a girl he'd been seen with was missing, and you'd think that most people would want to talk to police to rule themselves out. However, sometimes people are scared. Not everyone trusts law enforcement, and Joshua had reasons why he may not have cared for police. As they looked into him, they found out that Joshua Huerter was a 29-year-old born February 27, 1988, making him 7 years older than Jenna. When Joshua was only 4 years old, his father Octavio was murdered on the outskirts of Philadelphia. A worker walked into a sewer brick contracting company on January 21, 1993, and he made a very horrifying discovery. Octavio's body was wrapped in a trash bag. The 5 feet 9 inches, 32-year-old had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of his head, execution style. His arms were tied behind his back, and he was shoved and contorted to fit inside a garbage bag. This case was never solved, and as you can imagine, Octavio's death was hard on Joshua and his family. Maybe this is why he was aloof about getting back to investigators. But in the meanwhile, Jenna's brothers Jeb and Jacob busied themselves by making missing persons flyers and hanging them all around campus. The flyer showed a picture of Jenna smiling next to a screenshot of her walking in public on Wednesday night. The flyer read, "Temple student Jenna Burla, 22, has been reported missing by the Lower Southford Police Department. She was last seen in the area of Pubweb on August 31st, 17 at 2 a.m., wearing the clothing pictured above." Beneath this was a phone number for an anonymous tip line in the Temple Police Department. Jenna's friends and family passed these flyers out to students, and the university sent out a mass email. Jenna's sister Janelle also made a Facebook post asking anyone with information to please reach out to their father Ed, and it was reposted over 22,000 times. After years of Jenna showing up for her community, the community was showing up for Jenna. On Friday afternoon, September 1st, a young man named Jack Miley called that tip line. He said that he was roommates with Joshua and wanted to provide information about the evening of August 30th. He explained that he had gone bar hopping with him with the intention of getting plastered and picking up women. Jack said that Joshua was a former Temple University student who was currently taking some time off, but still living in the area and hanging out with other students. Jack said that he left the bars around 1. A man went back to their apartment where he slept until about 10 a.m. He woke up with a massive hangover, but when he did get up, he said he saw Joshua in the kitchen surrounded by cleaning products. That's when Jack noticed what looked like blood on the floor, scratches on Joshua's neck, and a cut on Joshua's hand. Jack said the cut was more like a stab wound. It looked like it went all the way to the bone. Now, of course, you see your roommate like this, and you ask him, "What the hell happened to you?" Joshua said that he blacked out that night and fell into a prickly bush. Then the two kind of just joked around about this as another casualty of a crazy night out on the town. Jack said that at that point, Joshua told him he was just going to finish cleaning up the blood from his wound and then probably go to urgent care to get stitches because it would not stop bleeding. Now, I know this might sound insensitive, but Jack thought it was hilarious. He thought only Joshua would get so wasted that he falls into a bush and needs stitches. Jack ended up telling Joshua that he was going to run some errands, and then his sisters were coming over because they planned to take a trip to Long Island to visit family for Labor Day weekend. Joshua was like, "Okay, that's cool, but please don't let anyone use my bedroom," which is pretty normal when your roommates are going to have people over. This is also maybe why Joshua wasn't answering, because it was a holiday weekend. But all this sounded very alarming. Was Jenna with Joshua when he allegedly fell? Did they part ways? When did all of this occur? And why was he just getting stitches the next afternoon? So once Joshua left for urgent care and Jack went and did his errands, he said he came back with his sisters, but he didn't listen to Joshua. He gave them free rein of the entire apartment, including access to Joshua's room. So much for an obedient roommate. But nothing was seen that was out of the ordinary. Jack called Joshua as he left for New York, saying that he was now headed out of town. Now Joshua actually told him he too was out of town, visiting North Carolina. Now, Jack did think this was a little weird, because he had never heard Joshua mention that he had family or any business going to North Carolina. So, once he saw the reports that this woman, Jenna, was missing, he didn't know what to make of his roommate Joshua's story, and that is why he called in the tip line. I'm going to pause here to point out a few things. First of all, I'm assuming Jack called in because he thinks something could have happened to Jenna. Considering we've got blood, we've got Joshua's hand that needs stitches. But this story kind of implies, if he's saying that Jenna could have been hurt and that's why he's calling in, it implies that Jenna was over at their apartment in the early morning hours of August 31st when Jack was already in bed. and he doesn't hear anything. Is that odd? Secondly, Jack let his sisters into Joshua's room without permission, but there wasn't anything off about the room to cause them to be concerned. And third, Jack left right afterward, out of state. See, everyone's a suspect until they're not. So the investigator wondered if Jack could actually be involved, and maybe he was calling in this tip to get the police off his back. They wondered if he was making up a story about Joshua skipping town. Well, he skipped town for all the police knew. Maybe Jack had those injuries since all they were relying on was his call and his words. But maybe he was an upstanding citizen, and his tip was evidence they needed to do more digging. But this was all they had right now. So, Detective Walmate caught wind of Jack's tip and called Jack to ask him himself about what he had seen. After they finished talking, he asked Jack to call Joshua and ask him about Jenna and her disappearance. Well, Jack must have called because at 4:10 p.m. on September 1st, Joshua called Walmate back. At this point, the detective asked him if he was in North Carolina, and he said no, he wasn't. He didn't know what Jack was talking about. He said, "I'm in South Philadelphia," and that he just woke up for the day, which is why he missed the earlier calls. He told Walmate he wasn't that far away, and he promised to meet at Temple Security Department at 5 p.m. Spielums. That way they could sit down, talk, and he could provide them with any information he could. Walmate waited, but Joshua never showed up that night. But that didn't matter because his phone records had come in, meaning more departments were about to get involved in this case. I'm talking the FBI, the Honell Police Department, and Pennsylvania State Police at Dunmore Barracks. Now Dunmore is in Lackawanna County in northeastern Pennsylvania, and Joshua's phone was pinging in Paw Paw Township in the Poconos Mountains within 45 minutes of Dunmore. This means he could have lied about being in South Philadelphia, and all of this was making Joshua look pretty guilty. Not saying where you really are causes some red flags to go up, so the FBI provided the address where the police could find Joshua. Corporal Benjamin Clark headed to that property where Joshua's phone pinged. There was a wooden cabin on a lakefront property. It was really nice and part of a gated community on Shore Drive. Records showed it belonged to Joshua's grandmother, Ina Stallo, and it was the perfect isolated place to relax, hike, fish, and hang out on a family holiday weekend. Clark knocked on the door Friday evening, and nobody answered. He did consider going inside, but instead he decided to wait in his car. He didn't have to wait long because Joshua ended up pulling up with his grandmother in the driveway. He told Clark that he'd already talked to the police. He didn't know Jenna and had already let them know that he couldn't help them because he didn't have any more information. When Clark asked Joshua why he was out visiting his grandmother's house, Joshua said it's Labor Day weekend. He had a heavy fall semester at Temple, and this was his only weekend that he really had time to go visit. But we already know he's not a current student, so why is he being so evasive? It's not normal. But we know his father was murdered, so maybe he held a grudge against law enforcement. Clark started to size up Joshua's appearance and noticed those stitched-up cuts on Joshua's hand and that there were scratches on his neck. So of course, since Clark had him with him there, he asked Joshua what his injuries were all about. Joshua said, "Oh, these scratches? They're from earlier in the week. I hooked up with a woman named Vicky from New Jersey." He said the cuts on his hand were actually from a cereal bowl. So wait, what about the fall in the bushes? Now it's a cereal bowl? Interesting. Joshua explained that when he got back from the bars in the morning of August 31st, he made himself some cereal to eat, but he was blackout drunk and passed out. He shattered the bowl and cut himself on the pieces. Now this was an entirely different story than the one his roommate Jack said about the bushes. So either Joshua was lying, or Jack was lying, and maybe they were both involved in Jenna's disappearance. Clark requested that Joshua return with him to Dunmore, so Joshua went with his grandmother to the police station, where officers took photographs of him and his injuries and waited for the Philadelphia police to arrive. If you're watching, here's what Joshua looked like that night. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a gray sweatshirt. I was trying to make out what it said on it. It looked like it said second class, and then something about officer association. He's also wearing a pair of dirty-looking sneakers without laces in them, just the Velcro straps. You can kind of see the band-aids on his right hand in this photo. So they had him remove his outer clothing and strip down to only his underwear. I noticed at this point he had a chest tattoo, and it's a phrase I've seen many times. It reads, "Feel the fear and do it anyway." This is an inspirational quote I've seen many times about not giving up. He's got another smaller tattoo on his upper left chest area, above his bicep, and one across his right shoulder. His body really doesn't appear to have any significant injuries on it. However, when you get up close, you notice that there are some pretty nasty scratches on his lower left chin and neck area. They don't appear to be love marks. I mean, I understand a little passionate scratching, maybe down the back or something, but these look like defensive wounds, like someone was trying to hurt him and push him away, especially if the person was right-handed and clawing at him. But now let's look at his right hand. A bunch of cuts and gashes. I mean, one of them is, of course, deep enough for stitches, and they look bad. They could be from a fall or maybe that ceramic bowl, but they could also be from a knife. With the way that they look sliced and punctured, they look fresh. A detective took Joshua in for further questioning, and finally the search warrant for his apartment went through. Detective Sweeney looked throughout Joshua and Jack's place from top to bottom. At first glance, it was a messy college kid's home, but as you really examined it, there was blood in places where it shouldn't be, which was swabbed for DNA. First, there was blood on a light blue broken ceramic bowl. So was Joshua being honest? Maybe, but maybe not, because the blood wasn't on one sharp broken piece like it had cut him. Instead, it was splattered across the broken bowl, which was lying on the floor. It's almost as though someone had bled onto it, but who? Joshua? Or was it Joshua and Jenna? There was also blood on the right of the kitchen sink, as well as a knife close by. More blood droplets were on the lid of the trash bin, on a blade of that blunt kitchen knife, on a futon, on toilet paper, and on a toilet paper roll. Strips of gauze, a pair of sandals by the back door, and several pieces of clothing. All looked like they could belong to Jack or Joshua and had blood on them. But it was when they found a black hair tie that was the first indication that maybe a female had been there. We know that Jack's sisters were there, and it wouldn't be that unheard of if Jack or Joshua had brought girls home on a regular basis. They were still looking for signs that Jenna had been there. Next, investigators found paperwork from Joshua's urgent care visit and drugs. I don't just mean some painkillers to help with his hand. No, there was a lot of drugs. There were narcotics and painkillers like Xanax and marijuana. Could actually guess how much marijuana was in this apartment. It wasn't just an ounce. It wasn't 2 ounces. It wasn't just a gallon-sized bag, no. There were nearly 15 bags the size of pillowcases full of weed in this apartment, and it was worth thousands of dollars. What's more, they found $20,000 in cash. This wasn't your normal drug dealer. This was a guy or 2 guys who serviced pretty much the entire Temple University community. And okay, that is one kind of crime, but investigators are still searching for Jenna. That is when they looked inside the trash bin. And this case went back in that original direction because they found a light blue sweatshirt, a sports bra, and a white shirt that said "Positive Vibes Only," Jenna's clothing that she had been wearing last. Why would Jenna's clothing be in his trash? Well, investigators can think of many reasons, and none of them are good. They hadn't found a murder weapon per se, and they didn't know where Jenna was, but Joshua had withheld evidence. Therefore, he was arrested at 9 p.m. that Friday night. I know I already told you a little bit about 29-year-old Joshua. I told you about how his dad was murdered and how hard that was on him and his family. After high school, he went to Lacuna College where he sold drugs and faced the consequences, so that wasn't a new thing for him. In September of 2012, he was charged with public drunkenness and misconduct, and in October of 2012, he got a DUI for possession of drugs with the intent to deliver. After high school, he went to Lacuna College, where he sold drugs and faced the consequences, so that wasn't a new thing for him. In September of 2012, he was charged with public drunkenness and misconduct, and in October of 2012, he got a DUI for possession of drugs with the intent to deliver. Then he got a second DUI that same month, and in July 2013, he was charged with burglary while under the influence. Joshua had broken into someone's home and stolen electronics, credit cards, even laundry detergent, and half a keg of beer. He was given 2 years of probation, and during probation, in July of 2014, he was under house arrest for yet another DUI. That fall, he transferred from Lacuna College to Temple University, where he was an on-again, off-again student studying advertising and risk management. I'm telling you this because Joshua was the most logical culprit for investigators. I mean, he had a history of lying, dealing drugs, reckless driving while intoxicated, and violence in connection with his addictions. When police were canvassing his apartment complex, neighbors gave Joshua a pretty bad review. 29-year-old Joshua and his 24-year-old roommate Jack had moved in that past month. Even though they had been friends for a couple of years, they were arrogant partiers. One woman, her name is Charmila, said that Joshua was a friend of a friend and they'd hung out together in large groups. Joshua acted narcissistic and arrogant in front of other men like he was competing with them. He even offered to sell her drugs and verbally harassed her and her sister. Definitely not good signs. Another woman named Natalie, who lived right across the street, said Joshua was friendly but gave her a bad feeling. He'd also offered to sell her painkillers and weed, and was always inviting her to come hang out. She declined, and now that he was being investigated in connection with a missing woman, she really started thinking that that could have been her, and that was scary. She said about him offering her drugs that it was actually a really common thing. Almost every time I saw him, he was always outside smoking, and he would always ask me, and I would tell him I don't smoke, referring to weed. Natalie also said that since he knew she was a soccer player from Yardley, he would brag to her about how he also played soccer for Temple University and was on their varsity team. Recently, Joshua made up the story about how his dad was a professional soccer player. Well, Natalie knew that all of this was a lie. She didn't know that Joshua's dad had died or was murdered, but she did know that Joshua wasn't going to Temple, that he had taken time off that fall semester. But remember how Joshua told Detective Clark he had a really busy semester? Those were lies, and there's nothing stopping a liar from lying again. Natalie had also seen Joshua get into an altercation with a woman who burst into his gate. They were arguing, and then she punched him. Natalie said she had no idea who this woman was, but she had heard screams, so she ran outside that day to find out what was going on. Now, this was not in connection with Jenna's case, because it happened weeks before, but none of this looked good for Joshua, who was still in custody at the time. They still had to figure out what he'd been doing for the last 2 days. Where was Jenna, and is his roommate Jack involved at all? The next morning, on Saturday, September 2nd, Joshua's stepfather called the police with another tip. He said that Joshua came to visit on the evening of August 31st. Joshua's mom and stepdad lived in a house in Jenkintown, another suburb of Philadelphia, about 25 minutes away from where Joshua's apartment was. Joshua's stepdad said that Joshua stayed the night before he took a Lyft ride to his grandmother's house, so police filed search warrants to investigate the houses of Joshua's mom and his grandmother, 2 places they knew he had been. Next, Detective Edward Capel of the Philadelphia PD reached out to Lyft's security department. He was hoping that they had some kind of records of this ride. Now, Lyft told them that on September 1st, Joshua had requested a ride from Jenkintown to Holly, Pennsylvania, which is a borough near Powpack Township. This is where Joshua's grandmother's house was. Joshua's driver was a man named Avery Tucker. But what was strange is that the records showed that ride had been canceled. So the detective met with Avery Tucker, and Avery said that when he went to pick up Joshua, Joshua actually convinced him to cancel the Lyft ride confirmation and shut off the app. Then he offered Avery $200 in cash to drive him from Jenkintown to North Pennsylvania. Now, this was more than he would have made if he had used the app, since he wouldn't have to split the money with Lyft, so Avery agreed. Then he said he watched an older man helping Joshua load a large plastic bin into the hatchback of his car. That's super suspicious. This was a 100-mile drive, about 2.5 hours, and Joshua fell asleep along the way. Once they got to Joshua's grandmother's property, Joshua actually asked Avery to help him unload that plastic bin from the back of his car. Avery told investigators it was a large, opaque kind of navy blue plastic tote with gray or silver-colored handles, like you might see in a garage to store your Christmas decorations or Halloween costumes. Avery said he lifted his side of the plastic tote, and it was very heavy. He even made a joke to Joshua, saying, "What do you have in here, bricks?" And Joshua said it was school books. So Avery set the tote down in the driveway and he left. That's all he knew. When all of this information was being provided, Jenna had been gone for over 48 hours. Detectives were scared of what this meant. If Joshua was bringing a heavy plastic container to his grandmother's house, was he trying to get rid of evidence? And did he succeed? When I say evidence, I think you know what it could be. On the morning of the 2nd, the police followed yet another clue, the urgent care paperwork. They met with a practitioner named Matthew Montagna, who treated Joshua for a hand injury on the 31st. However, Matthew wasn't able to reveal any new information. Everything they already knew from the paperwork was related to them. Then, after 9 a.m., the Pennsylvania State Police got a call. It was from a man named George Stabo. This was Joshua's step-grandpa. He was married to Joshua's maternal grandma A&Z, the one that Joshua had visited. Joshua said on the phone call that he finished breakfast that morning and planned to do some yard work for the rest of the day. There was a white equipment shed near the lake on their property, and George was checking it out to make sure there weren't any snakes inside. He confirmed there were no snakes, but there was something new in there, a large blue storage bin. Not knowing what it was doing in the shed and what was inside, George decided to open it. He said he saw a blanket folded just beneath the lid, and underneath that he found the remains of a human body. It was a young, dark-haired woman wearing no clothes, and her skin was a yellow color. So obviously, investigators believe this had to be Jenna. It actually makes me nauseous to think about what a small space that is and how long it took to find her. Joshua had lied about there being books inside this tote. He lied about a lot of things. He was covering up a crime, and from the scratches on his body he had something to do with it. The search warrant for Joshua's family's home in Jenkintown didn't come back with anything new. However, inside his grandmother's cabin, there was a navy blue zippered bag, similar to a man's purse, containing basic clothes, underwear, socks, t-shirts, toiletries, and it didn't belong to George. It contained $3,000 in cash. Joshua had already left Philadelphia, so did he plan to leave the entire state of Pennsylvania and just disappear? They seemed to have caught him just in time. They may have never found Jenna had it not been for all these tips. As I've said before, if you see something, say something. It's so important. So at 10:49 p.m., Joshua tells Detective Joseph Marie of the Philadelphia Police about his whereabouts the last few days. Now at this point, he doesn't know that a body has been found. So here he is, saying that on August 31st he went to urgent care, he was stitched up, and he got that cut from a shattered cereal bowl. Then he said that evening, his cousin Eric Carlson came over and helped him move a few things, including a plastic tote full of old books and things to bring to his mom's garage in Jenkintown. Then, on the 1st, he paid a Lyft driver to take him to his grandma's house. Joshua didn't admit to anything sinister, but it didn't matter because they had all they needed. He was charged with murder, abusing a corpse, and tampering with evidence, but he planned to plead not guilty to all counts. He requested an attorney, which is his right, but allegedly he was told he couldn't have one. But I'm getting much too far ahead of myself. On Saturday morning, Ed and Jackie were at their home, and their house was packed with their extended family. For all they knew, Jenna was still out there, but they were losing hope. That's when Ed got a phone call from the Philadelphia Police Department, requesting that he and Jackie come down to the station. They didn't know whether this was going to be good news or bad news, but wanting to speak in person is a sign that it's probably not good. When they arrived, Jenna wasn't there, and Ed and Jackie's hopes were shattered. Officers confirmed that they believed they had located Jenna and she was no longer alive, though they still needed an official confirmation through an autopsy. The woman they found matched her description, and an arrest had been made. Ed, of course, wanted to know every detail. Jackie wanted everything to be over. They could not believe that this was the reality. When they got home, Jackie went straight to her room. After spending almost every day with her daughter for 22 years, she couldn't face anyone but her children and her husband until she could process all of her emotions. On that Saturday evening, Ed posted Jenna's picture on Facebook with the words, "Our beautiful angel Jenna is now in heaven. Now I know for sure that you can have a broken heart. R.I.P. honey." I feel so bad for her family. By then, all of Jenna's friends knew she was gone. Her best friend from kindergarten, Tori, screamed with grief. Aaron couldn't stop crying. Jesse said he didn't realize how much hope he had until it was all gone, and the empty feeling crushed him. Of course, Davis felt guilty, knowing that he had been out with her that evening. But it wasn't his fault. It was only her killer's fault for choosing to take Jenna's life. Jenna's autopsy was on Sunday, September 3rd in North Pennsylvania. She was examined by Wayne County Coroner Edward Howell, as well as a Philadelphia medical examiner. Her manner of death was homicide, and her cause of death was strangulation and blunt force trauma to her head. Now, this is not going to be easy to hear, so I would suggest skipping a little ahead if you don't want to hear the details of the way a person has been killed. Jenna had bruising and lacerations all over her torso. She had been hit 28 times with what they believed was probably a fist, causing bruising to her neck, face, and upper chest area. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms from trying to hold off her attacker. Jenna was actually bitten on her right arm and stabbed in her left arm with a sharp object. That could have been that kitchen knife. She had been hit over the head with a hard object, causing a laceration on her head, as well as head trauma. Because of the cuts, it was determined that that broken cable at the crime scene was actually one of the weapons used. Also, Jenna had been strangled, and it looked like it had been done with a person's hands. It was so forceful that her larynx, the part of the throat containing the vocal cords, was broken. Since she had been found without her clothing, examiners did clippings of her fingernails, as well as oral, vaginal, and rectal swabs. As you probably know, DNA takes months to process, so they had to wait on those results, as well as her toxicology report, which could take 6 to 8 weeks. But the investigation wasn't over yet. Philadelphia police returned to Joshua and Jack's apartment one more time. They wanted to find out more. And one of the neighbors said, on August 31st, around 4 o'clock in the morning, she heard a woman screaming from apartment 1R. The woman sounded scared and in pain, and this surprised officers. From what they gathered, Jenna did go back to Joshua and Jack's apartment, but that was around 2 a.m. Before that, she had called her friends, asking for help to get home from the bar. So, did this mean that she was uncomfortable with Joshua before going home with him? Or was she just really trying to get home, and that's what she meant by she needed help? They figured she probably left with him because she felt like she had no other choice. In that case, why would 2 hours pass in silence before this neighbor heard a scream? Did the neighbor get the time wrong, or maybe things escalated? Now, it did appear there was another cereal bowl with some cereal left over in the sink. Could they have gone back to Joshua's, hung out normally, ate together, and then something changed? To find out more, investigators looked at surveillance footage they got from outside Joshua's apartment. Sure enough, they see Jenna and Joshua walking with about 2 feet between them, and then they enter Joshua's home at 2:32 a.m. Jenna never leaves. They never see her re-emerge from that front door or walk down the sidewalk anywhere in front of the building. I think we know why. Around 6 p.m., a person they had not identified at that point knocked at the door. At 7:09 p.m., he and Joshua struggled down the stairs, carrying exactly what you would expect, the blue plastic tote. Joshua already said that it was his cousin Eric Carlton who helped him move the tote to Jenningtown, so was this that guy? Investigators tracked down Eric and talked to him. Eric said that he and Joshua had been friends ever since they were young. Eric's uncle married Joshua's mom, and they were only a year apart, so they got along really well. When their parents ended up getting divorced, they kept in touch, mostly because Eric actually bought weed from Joshua. Eric and Joshua talked that afternoon, and Eric came over to Joshua's so they could hang out and smoke. When he arrived at Joshua's place, he found him cleaning up blood. This was hours after Jack had encountered Joshua doing the exact same thing, so there must have been more blood than one investigator saw when they searched the place. Eric said he asked Joshua what happened, and Joshua said he was drunk and trying to open a beer, and it shattered and cut his hand. So this is now the third story that he's told about this cut. Eric told investigators that he and Joshua smoked in the apartment, and then Joshua asked Eric to drive him to his mom's place and help him move a tote of books into Eric's car. He remembers saying, "Dang, this is heavy," wondering what kind of books Joshua was reading. Then Eric did drive Joshua to Jenna in town. If Eric wasn't knowingly involved in Jenna's murder, investigators assumed the same situation for Jack. CCTV footage showed that Jack entered Pubweb with Joshua on the night of August 30th and left at 1 am on August 31st, exactly when he said he did. As for skipping town, the Long Island trip was a pre-planned vacation. Jack's family had made Labor Day plans long before the semester even started. If Jack's sisters had gone into Joshua's bedroom while Jenna was still in the apartment, it's probably because she was already inside that blue tote. The only question was, why hadn't Jack heard anything? The walls in this apartment building were thin. A neighbor heard screaming at 4 a.m., so what are the odds that Jack slept through a murder? It's not unheard of if you're passed out drunk and you live in a noisy neighborhood. But on September 7th, a week after Jenna's death, a vigil was held at Temple University in the Founders Garden. Even though Jenna hadn't been at Temple for a long time, hundreds of students showed up to support her friends and her family. In the middle of the garden, visitors were invited to write notes around a picture of Jenna smiling with one of the puppies from an animal shelter. The clothing store where Jenna worked ended up selling clothes in Jenna's honor, and her friend from Harleyville started a GoFundMe that raised over $5,000. Jenna's viewing was that evening, and her funeral and a Catholic Mass were held on September 8th, where the family asked that in lieu of flowers, all donations be made to a memorial fund. All that money raised was going to help Jenna's blessing bags for the homeless. Her mother and father felt like Jenna would want to keep that charity going. It was the perfect opportunity to share her story, spread love, and make a difference in people's lives. And that is what Jenna would have wanted. At Jenna's funeral, the pamphlets contain one of her signature quotes. It said, "I don't care about my outward appearance, because it's the least that matters. What really matters is your insides, your soul, your mind, your thoughts. Because your body is just a physical vessel of what's really important, and it's also extremely temporary. My soul will go on to live lives and lives, move from worlds to worlds, and have experience after experience. My body is just keeping me together in this reality, which is fine as long as you understand your greater purpose and that your true self can't be found outwardly, but must be searched for inwardly." I think that what she said is very profound, and I truly hope that Jenna is exactly where she wants to be. In the year and a half following her murder, the district attorney's office did everything in their power to find justice for Jenna's family without having to go to trial. They offered Joshua a 30 to 60-year sentence if he just chose to plead guilty to all counts, but he refused. He maintained his innocence. He said it wasn't him. Because of this, he faced life in prison since capital punishment rarely happens in the state of Pennsylvania, and the trial began in 2019. Jenna's friends showed up wearing cat ear headbands in her honor. Jackie stayed strong, and Ed vowed that no matter what pictures or videos were shown at trial, he would sit and watch it all, staring Joshua down the entire time. In opening statements, Assistant Prosecutor Jason Grinnell speculated that Jenna went back to Joshua's willingly and had sex with him. Now I'm going to get to the evidence and my thoughts in one moment, but it was speculated that when Joshua proposed that she had anal sex with him, Jenna resisted. She was no longer having fun and wanted to leave. We know that Jenna was a strong-willed woman. She stood up for herself and others, and if she didn't want something, she would let it be known. That is when it's believed that Joshua became forceful, and Jenna fought back, probably trying to run from the apartment, which resulted in a violent fight for her life on the kitchen floor. Joshua didn't just injure her, he used every means possible to take her life and her dignity. This also makes me believe that the sex was never consensual at all. These are just my 2 cents from reading everything I have. I think all she wanted was a place to go until her friends were able to come get her. But Joshua had other plans. Like his roommate said, their intention that night was to get wasted and pick up girls. There was definitely a struggle, no matter how it started. All the blood and the fingerprints on this crime scene, including the shoes, the kitchen knife, the trash can, and the plastic tote, belonged to Joshua, Jenna, or both. Joshua's DNA was beneath Jenna's fingernails. His DNA was found in all 3 places. The medical examiners had swabbed her vagina, mouth, and rectum. The evidence was overwhelming that they engaged in intercourse, but as I stated, I don't think Jenna was consensually having sex with this guy. If it wasn't forced, it was under the extreme influence of alcohol. First of all, we know she was drunk, and after the toxicology report came back, it was found that her blood alcohol level was 0.238. That's about 10 drinks, well past the legal limit. At this level of toxicity, many people struggle to even walk. Some people black out, and less experienced drinkers are at a risk for alcohol poisoning. Just because one person or both are drinking or drunk does not mean that they are both willing. Secondly, Jenna was asking for help from her friends before she even left with Joshua, meaning she didn't truly want to go home with him. Was she coerced? Did he act kind like he was helping her? What time did all this happen? We will never know, but it's no question that Joshua was there when Jenna was murdered. Joshua's defense attorney, however, David Nenner, gave a different perspective on this story. He said it wasn't Joshua at all. It was Jack Miley, Joshua's roommate of just 1 month and a student at Temple University. He was the one responsible for the murder, and Joshua covered everything up because he felt responsible. The defense said that Jack has a history of violence when intoxicated, and one time he got physical with a man at 7-Eleven after drinking. So he was arguing that this meant he was capable of violence against Jenna. But let's not forget about Joshua's record. In the defense's point of view and argument, they said that Joshua came on to Jenna. They got in a fight because Joshua wouldn't take no for an answer. So, there you go. Even the defense is admitting that she resisted from the start. Then the two argued. The defense said that Jenna, still drunk, took a knife and sliced Joshua's hand. They said then Jack woke up from all the commotion. He went into the kitchen and found who he thought was an intruder in his home, who had just stabbed his roommate. So he intercepted. He allegedly pushed her down the stairs and strangled her when she was at the bottom. This is quite a story. The defense attorney warned the jury that the prosecution might show them a text between Joshua and Jack, where Joshua admits that he murdered a woman while he was blacked out. Oh, that's interesting. So what's the excuse? Well, his defense attorney argued that Jack actually forced Joshua to send him that text after Jack killed Jenna, and Joshua was so scared of him that Jack threatened to harm him and his family if he didn't cover up all this crime and all the evidence. So for that reason, Joshua changed his plea. He was now pleading guilty, but only to tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. He wasn't pleading guilty to murder, he was pleading not guilty. After the first day of trial, Jenna's father told the group of reporters that he felt thrilled with the prosecution's efforts and asked them to support Jenna's blessing bags. The next day, Weiss was called to the stand, where Courtney Miley, who is Jack's sister, testified that Jack was a deep sleeper. She said if Jack was drinking or even smoking weed, there could have been 1,000 elephants stampeding in the room, and he would have slept through it. Now, I found that hard to believe until I actually heard Jack's testimony. I actually tried my hardest to put myself in the jury's position and hear all the evidence before I made my own opinion. But on the witness stand, Jack told the jury the full truth of August 30th when he went out to PubWeb with Joshua. He was very intoxicated. He said he consumed 1 milligram of Xanax, which you probably shouldn't mix with other substances, and a large amount of weed, 6 shots of liquor, and in his words, 12 to 15 beers. This is a dangerous mix, and Jack was not in his right mind. He said when he left the bar at 1 a.m., he went home and passed out, going to sleep on his bed. With that amount of depressant in your system, it is possible to sleep through almost anything, even a murder. Also, remember how Joshua told Jack that he was in North Carolina when Jack was on his way to Long Island. Well, the next day, Jack called in his tip to the police. The detective called Jack to ask him to call Joshua. Remember this whole story? Jack told the jury that he called Joshua 3 or 4 times before Joshua picked up. When he told him that the police were after him and asked about the cut on Joshua's hand, Joshua said again that he was in North Carolina, but now he said the cut on his hand was from a shattered cereal bowl. Jack didn't know why Joshua kept changing his story and also repeating that he was in North Carolina. It's not like any of this affected Jack, since he was already out of town himself. But if Joshua thought Jack might tell the investigators about the blood, it made sense that he would tell Jack to make sure he said he was in North Carolina. That way, he would relay North Carolina to the police, which would throw them off the trail and give Joshua enough time to dispose of evidence. Finally, when Jack was asked if he heard anything that night, screams, yells, a struggle, anything, Jack said no. A psychiatrist named Dr. Levy said that consuming marijuana, Xanax, and alcohol in one session could cause a blackout. In blackouts, people can become violent, they can become homicidal, they can want to self-inflict pain and forget their actions in the morning. It's very possible that Jack did hear or do something that night that he couldn't recall, but there was no proof that Jack was involved in a homicide or that he even had any intent to do so when Jenna walked into his apartment. We don't even know if he saw Jenna. None of his DNA was at the crime scene. Just because he had a wild side and took drugs did not mean he was responsible for what happened in his apartment. I'm sure the knowledge of the murder changed Jack forever. I'm not saying he's entirely innocent here, but in the long run, the evidence doesn't match up. It doesn't show that Jack was responsible for Jenna's murder. And neither was Jenna. In some cases like this, I sadly do see a lot of victim blaming in my comments. Maybe because a woman is social, she goes out in the town, maybe she has a boyfriend, but she still wants to go out and have fun. Or maybe she dresses a certain way, or parties. So let's not forget who the real monsters are in these cases: the killers. Their actions go above and beyond any apparent laws a victim could have had that would put them in harm's way. Jenna did go out that night. She drank, but she also tried to call her friends for help, and when no one responded, she probably felt she had no choice other than to go with a stranger who chose to hurt her. Could she have done other things? Sure. Could she have called a cab or a rideshare? Yes, but we have no idea what Joshua said to her. Maybe those were her intentions at some point. Joshua, on the other hand, had his own plans for Jenna. They were both intoxicated to the point of being blacked out. They had actually been overserved by bartenders that night, and Joshua had a long criminal record and a history of harassment that culminated in murder. It makes me sad that Jenna, who stood for women's rights, lost her life to a cruel man, the type that she had been warned about. It's evil irony, and it is such a shame. After 9 days of testimony, Joshua was found guilty and given life in prison for murder, on top of a consecutive 9 years for his other 3 charges. He, of course, tried to appeal his sentence because he said the police hadn't gotten the right search warrants or let him consult an attorney when he asked, but his sentence was affirmed. The judge said Jenna's murder was depraved and her killer deserves every excruciating moment as he spends the rest of his life in Forest County Correctional Facility. Jenna's mom, Jackie, said after the trial she misses her daughter. Jenna was unapologetically herself. She wanted justice and liberation for all. It's been over 5 years, and Jenna's bedroom still looks the way it did when she went to college. Sometimes Jackie sleeps in Jenna's bed, which makes her feel connected with her daughter's spirit. My heart hurts for that mama, who never got to see her daughter grow up and have a family of her own. Ed felt that justice was served, and he and Jackie went on to sue PubWeb for overserving Jenna and her friends, which contributed to the circumstances surrounding her murder. They also turned their attention to Jenna's blessing bags, which are still going strong. They host an annual fundraising event called Designer Per Bingo. If you are in the Philadelphia area, you should try to go. All year, outside organizations donate or collect supplies to make these blessing bags, and they distribute those backpacks far and wide, working with police to not only bless the people of Philadelphia, but also surrounding cities. You can tell they're Jenna's backpacks from their tags. It's a community effort to honor Jenna's legacy, and I'm so glad that I can contribute to keeping her name alive. I'm gonna leave you with Jenna's own words. She once said, quote, "I want to change the world. I want to make a difference. I don't want to just go through the motions in life. I want to help people. I want to stand up for what is right and fight against what's wrong. This world has so much potential, and so little being done about it. You can think I'm crazy or ridiculous for thinking I can make an impact, but that's why I will. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." End quote. Online dating, it used to be taboo, but now it's part of everyday life. But how safe is it? How can you be sure who you're really talking to? What if the person you meet is nothing like their profile? Or worse, turns out to be a predator with sinister intentions? Technology makes it all too easy to hide behind a screen, and this story highlights how it can be a tool for harm in the wrong hands. The story begins on December 1st, 2011. 15-year-old Logan Starbuck sent her mother Channon a text message at 2:45 p.m. asking where she was and who was going to pick her and her siblings up from school. By 3 o'clock, Channon should have been waiting for Logan and her younger sister and brother at the pickup line, but it was after 3, and Logan was worried. About 20 minutes after Logan sent that text to her mom, Channon texted back, saying, "Dad, I have a headache, stay there," meaning her father was going to pick them up. At 3:06 p.m., Logan received another reply from Channon's phone that said, "Send Marsh a note. Dad will be there in 10 minutes. Marsh is actually a nickname that Channon used for her 10-year-old son, Marshall. However, Channon's husband, Clay Starbuck, also failed to make it to school to pick up the kids. So Logan texted her mother twice more, and these text messages went unanswered. Eventually, Logan contacted her 21-year-old brother, Austin, who worked at a local glazing company, and she asked him to pick them up because none of the children had a spare key to their mother's home. Austin took them to their father Clay's house. Austin did think it was odd that he couldn't reach his mom either. Austin Starbuck, like I said, dropped off his younger siblings at their father Clay's house in Deer Park, which was only about half a mile away from Channon's home. When the couple separated, Clay moved out with their 2 oldest children, 21-year-old Austin and 18-year-old Blake, who was a senior in high school. Logan, Serena, and Marshall, the couple's 3 younger children, stayed with Channon full-time, but they did visit their father on a regular basis. Even after the divorce, Clay remained actively involved in Channon's life. Since Clay lived close to the school, he would pick up his 3 children every morning and drive them to school, and then Channon would usually be at the school to retrieve them. But not that day. Things were different that day. First, Clay had texted Channon that morning asking if she could take the children to school instead of him because his vehicle had broken down. He simply texted, "Car quit, can you take the kids?" In December, the temperature in Deer Park was freezing. This is in Washington, so Clay wanted his children to be comfortable in the car. He would usually wake up early and drive around the block a few times before he drove the half a mile to Channon's house to pick them up. That way, he could get the heater going. It would be nice and toasty in the vehicle. However, that morning, as Clay was warming up his car, it broke down on High Desert Road a few blocks away from his home in Deer Park. Since he couldn't get it started again, he couldn't drive the kids to school. That's why he texted Channon. She had texted Clay back and agreed to take the children to school that morning. She replied to him with just one letter, K, and she dropped the kids off at school before heading back home. Later, when his oldest son Austin returned home with his younger children, Clay asked, "Where is Channon?" The younger children explained how their mom never showed up to get them. Instead, she texted them, telling them that Clay was supposed to be on his way. After he didn't show up, they called Austin. When Clay checked his phone at 3:37 p.m., he found out that he hadn't turned it on since earlier that morning. Channon had texted Clay at 3:17 and said, "I just got up. Can you get the kids?" But Clay didn't see this text. The fact that his ex-wife didn't show up to pick up the children didn't really bother Clay because these things happen. Plus, he expected to see her that night at Blake's high school for a basketball game. Clay just assumed he would find out what happened when they were at the high school. At 5:45 p.m. of that same evening, Clay texted Channon to say he and the kids were headed to the game at Deer Park High School, telling her, "If you feel better, call me, and I'll meet you at the booth so you don't have to pay." But that was the next thing that wasn't normal. Although Channon was supposed to show up at her son's basketball game, she never did, nor did she contact the kids or Clay to say why. Now, a bit concerned, Clay sent a few more texts to Channon, asking her to get in touch with him when she could. Following the game, Clay had still not received a text or a call back, so he and the children drove over to Channon's house. But when they tried to get inside, the door was locked and no one answered. They walked around the house, but they didn't see Channon inside or anywhere around the home. It was just dark, so they headed back to Clay's house. The thing is, the three youngest children didn't live at Clay's. They didn't have their everyday necessities. They'd always bring them over from their mom's house, and she still hadn't answered. So by that night, Clay figured he would just keep the kids until further notice. But because the kids did not have any fresh, clean school clothes, they did not go to school the next day. On Friday, December 2nd, 2011, Clay and the children had yet to hear from Channon that next day, and their concerns continued to grow. That afternoon, Clay texted Channon again, stating that if he didn't get a response by 7 p.m. that night, he was going to call the police. Meanwhile, Channon's mom, Melanie, lived back in Florida. She was also concerned. She had been trying to call Channon, but she kept getting a message saying her daughter's voicemail was full. Melanie had this terrible feeling in the pit of her stomach. She felt like something had happened to her daughter. When she checked with Channon's siblings, Stephen and Amy, they hadn't heard from her either. So at 5 p.m., Melanie called law enforcement to request a welfare check on Channon. That evening, two deputies showed up, Jeff Shover and Dan Dutton. They got to Channon's around 6:15 p.m. The door was still locked and no lights were on. There was a package that had been delivered that day, and it was still sitting by the front door. When the officers knocked on Channon's front door and walked the exterior, no one answered, and they didn't see anything that seemed suspicious. After looking into a few windows, the officers decided that nothing unusual was going on. Since this was simply a welfare check and there were no signs of a disturbance, the deputies didn't have enough information to do things like apply for a warrant to go into the property. So after about 10 minutes, they left. When 7 p.m. rolled around on December 2nd and Clay still hadn't heard from his ex-wife, he called the police and also requested a welfare check on Channon. Around the same time, those two officers who had just left Channon's actually went to Clay's to see what he could tell them. He told them he was already on the phone with the police. Clay said he had no idea where Channon was, and he showed the deputies his phone and his text messages. The officers told Clay that they checked all the doors and the windows, and they saw no signs of foul play. So where was Channon, and why wasn't she answering? I wanted you to get some context as to what was going on that alerted people close to her that something may have been wrong. But I do want to backtrack and tell you all about Channon and what led up to this winter day in 2011. To understand the full story, I have to take you back in time. Channon Denise Conway was born on April 19, 1969 in the city of Anderson, Indiana. Channon was one of 3 children to her parents, Lawrence and Melanie. Along with her brother James and Stephen, Channon grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which for brevity we're going to refer to as the church in today's story. Channon was an active member of the church, and her deep faith guided her throughout her entire life. At some point during Channon's childhood, her parents decided to end their marriage. It appears that James stayed in Indiana with their dad, but Melanie moved with Channon and Stephen to Florida. Channon's mother remarried to a man named Charles Borza around 1975. From what I could gather, it seems like Charles already had 6 children of his own, which truly expanded their family. Then Charles and Melanie had a little girl named Amy. Channon and her brother Stephen were very close. They were like best friends, and she always invited him along with her. Being maternal came naturally to Channon. She loved babysitting for her neighbors, and she was also artistically gifted from a very young age. She was well known for her award-winning talent and passion for drawing. Channon attended Lake Mary High School in the city of Lake Mary in the greater Orlando metropolitan area, located in Seminole County. Channon was a loyal friend with a compassionate, kind, nurturing, and gentle disposition. She had always been very fun-loving and spent a lot of time with her friends, hanging out at the beach and of course Disney World because they were living in Florida now. Channon was a very busy student. She was involved in the school band, the Future Business Leaders of America, and was the historian for her high school's Tri-High Y Club. After graduating in 1987, she attended Florida State University in Tallahassee and then Seminole Community College, where she won a scholarship and obtained an associate's degree in art therapy. Channon wasn't the kind of person who wanted to be the center of attention. She was very soft-spoken and quiet. She had a gentle manner about her and was perfectly happy just being in the background, listening and observing social interactions. But she was also known for her quick wit, brilliant smile, and her laugh. People felt very comfortable around her. She made you feel at ease. Throughout her life, Channon had been an active member of her church. In 1989, when she was 20 years old, she met 24-year-old Clay Starbuck at a church dance while he was on vacation visiting South Florida. Clay Dwayne Starbuck was born on September 1, 1964. He grew up with his sister Kathy and parents Larry and Betty in Oregon before the family moved to Alaska, where Larry took up a job in law enforcement. Clay graduated high school in 1982 and then went on to study at a diesel and automotive school in Denver, Colorado. Around 1986, he returned to Alaska, where he began working on the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline. When Channon met Clay, he already had 2 children, a son and a daughter, Jesse and Drew, from a previous marriage of about 5 years. After somewhat of a whirlwind romance, Channon and Clay got married in Florida on June 1, 1990. It was Clay's second marriage and Channon's first. They ended up moving to Valdez in Alaska, where Clay continued working on the pipeline as a pipeline manager. Clay spent weeks away from Channon and his family in Alaska before returning home on leave. This was a huge change for Channon. She was moving away from her family, adjusting to an entirely different climate, and she had to be more independent. But she was totally in love with her new husband and welcomed her 2 stepchildren with open arms. She was committed to being the best stepmom and wife that she possibly could. When Channon was just 21 years old, she and Clay welcomed their first child together. His name was Austin, followed a few years later by another son whom they named Blake. Their first daughter, Logan, arrived in 1996. Logan was diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum and had special needs, but Channon took all of this in stride. Understandably, she was always protective of her daughter. Then Clay and Channon welcomed another little girl into the world, and we're going to call her Serena, out of respect for her privacy. Channon was a devoted, full-time stay-at-home mom. She loved her kids more than anything. She was their biggest cheerleader and threw herself into her children's school, sports, and church activities. Channon was also a fantastic cook. It was one of her many talents. She did a lot of quilting and sewing. Her creations were so amazing that she could sell her quilts for up to $1,000 at local craft shows. She also had the reputation for being one of the best seamstresses when it came to things like altering prom and wedding dresses. Later, she would even embroider the backs of her sons' baseball hats with their names and phone numbers in case they lost them. Throughout her church community, she also made handcrafted Christmas ornaments and was an active member of their book club. She loved helping out with the church nursery as well. But even though things were going great, the marriage became rocky. Clay had been unfaithful with a coworker, and remember, he was away a lot at this time, working on the pipeline. Questions of faith also became an issue. Channon remained deeply committed to the church, but Clay, who wasn't a member, didn't want to join. So Channon was heartbroken. In March 2000, the couple decided to divorce. 30-year-old Channon moved to Arizona and began dating another man named Dexter McClary. However, her heart was still with Clay, and within just a matter of months, she called Clay, saying she wanted to come back and try again. So Channon returned to Clay in Alaska and they got back together. That's really tough. Experts say that there are deal breakers when it comes to relationships, and one is religion. Sometimes you can try to make compromises, but when your beliefs are strong, it is hard. Sometimes love is just not enough. But they gave it another shot, and guess what? They made it work. Around a year later, in 2001, Channon gave birth to another child, a son they named Marshall. However, Clay had his suspicions. He thought that Marshall wasn't his biological son because he was doing the math and felt like the time frame for Channon's conception indicated she would have been dating Dexter. But nevertheless, Clay treated Marshall with the same love and affection that he did with all his other children. Determined to make the relationship work, Clay and Channon remarried on December 29, 2006. You don't always see couples reunite like this after a breakup, let alone a divorce, but it just shows you how much they truly loved each other at the time, and they were really trying to make it work. Around 18 months later, in May 2008, the family moved to Washington State, this time to the city of Deer Park, which is where I initially began the story. 39-year-old Channon had fallen in love with this area after visiting one of her longtime high school friends, Doug Carter, and his wife Janine. They lived in this area, raising their own children, and Deer Park seemed to be the perfect place to settle down and raise a family. Channon was excited about what the future would bring. It was precisely the kind of warm and supportive community that she always wanted for her kids. The family moved into a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom rental home at 509 North Riper Street in Deer Park. Every resident seemed to know one another and what was happening in their neighbors' lives. Those who lived there considered themselves lucky because violent crime was not a problem in Deer Park. The Starbucks and Carters subsequently spent a lot of time together. They went to theme parks, had barbecues, and celebrated holidays together. Clay continued working on the pipeline, but given the distance, he was away from home for weeks at a time. Channon tried to keep herself busy with the kids and their church activities, but being apart from her husband for such long stretches again took a toll on their marriage. In June 2010, the couple once again made the difficult decision to separate. No matter how much they loved one another, it was impossible to overcome the space and time apart, and they just couldn't make it work. The following month, in July, 41-year-old Channon filed for divorce. That is really tough, to pick up, move on, and go somewhere new, and then have to start your life over, especially being in your 40s. But Channon was determined to independently find ultimate happiness. Now, in no way is this a good coincidence. The irony is sad, but while Clay was working away in Alaska, he suffered a significant back injury and effectively had to stop working. He was placed on medical leave in February 2011. Work was one of the biggest things keeping Clay and Channon apart, and when he stopped working, he decided to return to Deer Park so he could be close to his children. He ended up moving into a house at 1625 East 2nd Street, about half a mile from where Channon was living. The idea of divorce never appealed to Clay. He told Channon that he would love her no matter what. However, Channon believed that the couple was incompatible and it was time for her to enjoy her newfound freedom, so they were not getting back together. However, it was nice that Clay was living close by for the children. Channon's mom, Melanie, was so proud of her daughter. Since the divorce, Channon had been doing a great job with the kids and becoming her own person. She was finding her own identity. Aside from Clay, he did undergo his surgery in July, and that same month, the couple's second divorce was finalized. 21-year-old Austin and 17-year-old Blake, who was a senior in high school at the time, decided to move out of Channon's and go live with their father. Now at this stage, he was on disability, and Channon was awarded custody of 15-year-old Logan, 12-year-old Serena, and 10-year-old Marshall. Clay was ordered to pay his ex-wife around $5,000 a month in child support and maintenance. Channon would also have to pay a small amount to Clay for Blake until he turned 18. But that was coming up. Having the freedom to do what she wanted, when she wanted, gave Channon a sense of independence that she hadn't had in a very long time, which can be very empowering. While Channon was eager to get back to work after being a stay-at-home mom for about 20 years, she also needed to do so because, as I mentioned, Clay was on disability, which meant he didn't have income coming in at the time. However, Clay being home in Deer Park made it so that he was around more and could help with the kids. They stayed with Clay every other weekend and every Wednesday after school. He also picked them up every morning to drive them to school, like I told you in the beginning. But Channon was really doing most of the work, especially with Logan, Serena, and Marshall. She wanted things to be as least disruptive as possible. After all the upheaval that comes with a marriage ending, especially with kids involved, Channon still drove them to all of their sports practices and basically wherever they needed to go. As messy and traumatic as the second divorce was for everyone, Channon knew she had to start making money as a single mom. So she enrolled in a dental hygienist course at Spokane Community College. Channon quickly became popular among her classmates and even arranged study sessions for everyone. That was just her maternal instinct. It came naturally. Even with everything that was going on in her life and the demands of single motherhood, Channon was driven and determined to be in a better situation for her kids. Clay was not able to keep up with the child support payments, and that meant Channon's car ended up getting repossessed. Ultimately, she had to resort to seeking assistance from the local food bank. Things were tough financially for Channon, but she knew, with the help of her friends and the church community, she was going to make it through. If she had to stay late at school, her friends would help with the younger children and make sure that they weren't left unsupervised. Despite Channon's struggles, in the summer of 2011, she graduated with honors from her dental hygienist course. Now, Channon spoke with her mom almost every single day. They were still very close, even though they were no longer living in the same state. She confided in her mother all the time about all the struggles that she was facing and her desire to possibly meet Mr. Right. So Channon wanted to get back out there in the dating world. She was 42 years old at the time, and she felt like she had a lot of love to give to the right person. Even if she just dipped her toe back in the water to see who was out there with no initial expectations of anything serious, she wanted to do it. Channon had given so much to others throughout her life that she really deserved happiness. So she joined online dating sites like Plenty of Fish, where her profile said she wanted to learn how to ski. That fall was her favorite season. When it came to her ideal partner, Channon said on the dating site that she was looking for someone tall and educated, with a good sense of humor. And that's what life was like before December 1st, 2011, where I began the story. Now, Channon isn't answering calls or texts, and officers didn't find her at her home. When they did that welfare check, Channon's mom, at this point, knew that she hadn't been able to land a job yet, and she always called her at 9 o'clock in the morning to check in. So something wasn't right. When I left off earlier, I explained the welfare check turned up nothing. After checking in with Clay that night, the deputies left. But later, Clay called Deputy Dutton at 11:42 p.m. for an update to see if Channon had been located, but no one had heard from her. The next morning, around 8 a.m. on December 3rd, which was now Saturday, Channon's friend Doug Carter, remember her longtime friend from high school, was also having trouble getting a hold of her. He, too, ended up calling the police. Doug asked them to again check on Channon, saying this was very out of character for her. Another call had come in to the police from Channon's mom, Melanie, saying that she still hadn't heard from her daughter, and it had almost been 48 hours. She was insisting that officers actually go inside to make sure that Channon wasn't passed out or in distress. Channon lived in a rented home, and remember, neither Clay nor any of Channon's children had a key. But this time, Deputy Shover and David Trotman contacted Channon's landlord so they could access the property. Maybe she accidentally fell and was inside unconscious. They just had to find out. So when Channon's landlord unlocked the door around 9:11 a.m., the detectives went inside. There was no sign of any disturbance, and the house was quiet. Channon's closed laptop was in the living room, and a gold Mercury stable was parked in the garage. Nothing was knocked over. It didn't indicate that there was any kind of struggle, and the house wasn't ransacked in a robbery or anything. In the main bedroom, Channon's cell phone was seen on the nightstand, and on a dresser was her journal and a bottle of lubricant. The bed was unmade, with the blankets sort of folded on the floor at the foot of the bed, but there were no sheets on the bed. The only linen on the bed were pillows and a mattress protector, which appeared at first glance to possibly have bloodstains on it. But that wasn't what deputies noticed right away, because they were confronted with something much more disturbing. They immediately called for backup. On the bed was the body of a partially naked woman. She was laying on her back, naked apart from an unbuttoned robe that covered her arms, but had been pulled up from behind her back and pulled open at the front, exposing her breasts. Though they were only able to do a preliminary identification, it was pretty clear that this woman was Channon Starbuck, and she was no longer alive. She had been brutally attacked. She was covered in bruises and had been badly beaten, possibly even tortured. Whoever had killed her hadn't left her in the position she had died in. Instead, they had posed her body in a sexually suggestive way. What I'm about to say is appalling, but sadly there's no other way I can explain it to you. Channon's legs were spread apart, and there was a sexual device that had been inserted inside of her. There was also an electric-powered massager that had been placed on her pubic area, with her hands on the massager and the cord threaded through her robe. Detective Mike Ricketts was informed of this shocking discovery and was appointed as the lead investigator. He was joined at the crime scene by Detective Mark Renz and Lyle Johnston, along with crime scene technicians. The investigators chose to focus their attention on the bedroom where Channon's body was found. While the bed sheets were missing, the blankets were folded onto the floor, and in the room was a gun safe that was open. On the shelf inside the safe were items like condoms and sex toys. But the thing is, they looked like they had been intentionally displayed. It wasn't the way somebody would normally keep these items. Aside from the severe bruising all over her body, there were no other signs of trauma evident. This meant investigators weren't immediately clear about her cause of death. They would have to wait for the autopsy. But it appeared that whoever had killed Channon had been led into her home. However, whoever had killed her seemed to be extremely angry and clearly wanted to degrade and humiliate her by posing her body in such an undignified way. So Johnston and Ricketts were disturbed by how this murderer had posed her, and it was their assumption that it was to humiliate her after death. But the technicians had to begin taking in the evidence. They took latent prints and also potential sources of DNA evidence. In terms of prioritizing what evidence was seized to be analyzed, officers worked in a circle. They started with Channon's body, and then they moved outward. Crime scene technicians took more than 100 pictures of this home. They gathered 12 latent fingerprints from the massager box, the bathroom mirror, the sink, the faucet handle, and a notebook. They also got latent prints from the top of the dryer door, and the interior of the front door. In one of the bathrooms that the kids used, there was a handprint on the bathroom wall. There were also some items that appeared to have blood on them, and they were swabbed. So was the bathroom drain, as well as the keyboards and mousepads for Channon's computer. They seized all of the sex toys, a fitted sheet, and a towel, both from the laundry room area, a washcloth, a blood-soaked mattress protector, and Channon's laptop and her cell phone. The detectives believed Channon had been killed in the main bedroom's attached bathroom, possibly after she got out of the shower. They thought the killer moved her onto the bed before cleaning the bathroom and putting the fitted sheet and towel into the washing machine. Around noon, Clay arrived at Channon's house to find out what was going on. When the police wouldn't tell Clay anything, he got mad. At this point, no one in Channon's life knew that she was dead, but it was obvious that something terrible had happened. When something like this happens, people in your neighborhood are going to know. There are going to be emergency vehicles outside. There might be a coroner's van, as well as things like yellow crime scene tape. This is when the investigators get their first clue into Channon's life. Clay told Detective Renz that his ex-wife was heavily involved in online dating and was seeing several men at the same time. He said that he had been concerned about Channon's safety, and while showing his phone, Clay explained that he had an 8-minute phone call with Deputy Dutton the day before, where he was explaining how concerned he was that he hadn't heard from Channon. Clay was told that he needed to go to the sheriff's substation in Dare Park, where he could give them more information. It was there that Detective Jim Dressback from the Major Crimes Unit met with him. and Clay told Detective Dressback the same thing he had just told Renz. He gave him a full rundown of the couple's relationship history, their divorce, and everything he knew. Now, mostly from hearing things from his kids, Clay said he really only communicated with Channon via text message and that they got along fine. He provided the names of all the sites that he knew about that she was using for online dating. He said that the last time he saw her was about 5 or 6 days earlier at a parent-teacher conference for Marshall. At this point, considering that the Major Crimes Unit was involved, Clay knew the news about Channon couldn't be good. He point-blank asked them, "Has she been murdered?" At this point, Detective Dressback did think it was odd that no one had told Clay what happened to Channon. When the detective broke the news that Channon had been murdered, Clay was overcome with grief. He buckled at the knees and collapsed to the floor. At one point, the detective overheard Clay actually vomiting in the restroom. When he was back in the interview room, Detective Dressback asked Clay what he thought happened to his ex-wife. He was distraught and shocked, but he actually yelled at them, "What do you mean? How would I know?" But Clay did have a clue. He said he believed that she had been killed by someone that she met online, but he wasn't able to, of course, provide any names of the people. How would he know? That was not a part of her life that she shared with anyone, especially her ex. When Detective Dressback asked Clay where he thought investigators should look, Clay said, "I would just look in her laptop and her phone." He even volunteered information, like I said, about their divorce. But he also claimed that Channon had been unfaithful. He told the detectives that at one point, he found nude pictures of Channon with other men on their shared computer, and that he even remembered a time during Mother's Day when she left the children with him so she could go on one of these online dates. Clay even mentioned that he believed Marshall wasn't even his biological son. This was just a lot to take in. But that's how it is in these interviews. You're just getting a rundown of someone's entire life in a matter of hours. So Clay went on to say that Channon often engaged in phone sex, saying that she did all kinds of things, even things with sex toys, dildos, and such. We know what they found at the crime scene. So could someone she was seeing have gone too far and become obsessed? It was anyone's guess, but Detective Dressback noticed that Clay had been crying throughout this entire interview. So he insisted Clay go home, be with his children, and they could catch this up later. As Clay was being escorted out of the station, he repeated the information about Channon supposedly visiting inappropriate websites, telling the detectives that their kids knew what she was doing and that they hated her for it. That was pretty harsh, but on one hand, it's important to tell everything you know. On the other hand, it looked like Clay resented Channon. After all, we know that Clay never wanted a divorce, and he probably didn't take too kindly to knowing his ex had been with all these other men, and that their children had seen this. That evening, one officer went door to door in Channon's neighborhood, asking anyone if they'd seen anything suspicious on Channon's street. 20 of the 40 homes he visited had no answer, but among the remaining homeowners, 13 said they saw nothing. The police department did not contact the neighbors any further, but that same evening, Channon's very close friend Doug and his wife, Janine Carter, went to Clay's house upon hearing the news. Doug and Janine had been friends with Channon since they were 15 years old back in Florida, and they had attended the same church. They wanted to be there for Channon's family during this time of grieving. Of course, Clay and the children weren't the only ones who had to be informed of the devastating news. Across the country, in Florida, a sheriff's deputy knocked on the door of Channon's brother, Stephen. The officer delivered the shattering news. It was then up to Stephen to inform his parents and his siblings that Channon was dead. It was the worst day of his life. When he told their mother, Melanie, she screamed, "No!" She desperately didn't want this to be true. None of her loved ones knew that when they saw Channon last, 4 months before her murder, happily posing for family photos, that they would never see her again. Whoever had done this had a 2-day start ahead of the police department, so investigators had a big job ahead of them. The sheriff's office appealed to the public to come forward about anything, any suspicious-looking people or vehicles that they may have seen in Channon's neighborhood in the month leading up to her death. Meanwhile, at Channon's autopsy, the medical examiner, Dr. Sally Aiken, found chest injuries consistent with the use of a stun gun. Channon had 10 broken ribs which were inflicted by blunt force, as well as a crushed larynx. The medical examiner noted that Channon weighed 169 pounds. Although the doctor believed that Channon's body had been moved after her death, she said it would have been difficult to move her, indicating that someone would have had to be pretty strong to have done this. However, there was bruising underneath her underarms, which is consistent and is seen in people who are unconscious and moved during things like a medical procedure or, in this case, a death. There were multiple fresh bruises all over her body, including one under her scalp, suggesting that she had sustained a blow to the head. There was bruising on both of her knees, on the tops of her feet, and on both of her hips. This suggested that at some point Channon was face down during this attack. There were pattern injuries and scrapes covering Channon's entire body, including her breasts and her left hand, potentially from what I told you looked like a taser gun. Some of the injuries suggested that she had been dragged along a surface, and at one point, she may have been stomped on by a shoe. This is just unbelievable what this woman had to go through. Hairs were also present on Channon's body that didn't appear to belong to her. The medical examiner believed that from the marks on her extremities, Channon's hands may have been bound together during the attack. The sexual device that I mentioned, and that was observed inside Channon, I'm going to call it the front and the back of Channon because I don't want to be too descriptive, was in the front when she was discovered. However, during the exam it was revealed that it had actually been inserted into the back first, prior to her death, and then afterwards post-mortem, meaning after she was already deceased. This device was taken out of the back and put into the front and left in that area. There were no other injuries suggesting that she had been the victim of forced intercourse, let's say. But from the appearance of these injuries, it was difficult to establish the exact time of her death. The medical examiner believed that Channon had died on either December 1st or early December 2nd. She had also been killed while face down and then posed on her bed. The cause of death was from the compression of the neck or strangulation. There was a broken bone in her throat, and the likely murder weapon was something soft, like a towel or someone's arm holding Channon in a chokehold position. Channon hadn't died immediately. Instead, she could have been alive for up to 2 hours before her lungs filled with fluid. In all, this poor woman sustained between 80 and 90 wounds to her body. They did swab her ankle area and her vaginal area, which seemed to contain male DNA, and they were hoping that these results would bring them more answers. On December 5th, Clay met with lead detective Mike Ricketts to inquire about Channon's autopsy results. Clay was interviewed for 3 hours, and he fully cooperated. He provided his cell phone information, consent for police to download a cell phone, DNA samples, fingerprints, and he also posed for photos to document any injuries he might have, especially when they looked at his hands. Since Channon was beaten, the detectives assumed Channon's attacker would have been wounded, but Clay Starbuck did not appear to have any injuries. When the Starbuck children were interviewed, which must have been super emotional and a surreal experience, they had just lost their mother. Austin, the oldest son, was asked when he saw his mother last and how the relationship was. He did tell them he lived with his father because they had a close relationship. Like Clay, Austin's hands were checked for injuries, and he was questioned about several scars and wounds that were on them. Austin explained that he worked at a glass company called GSI Glass, and he frequently had cuts and wounds on his hands. Channon's children told detectives that they watched To Catch a Predator. This is a show on the same network as Dateline, and they knew that there were weirdos out there who spent time on the internet. They were afraid that their mom had met someone like that. The older children told police their mom left them alone when she would go out on dates, and that they had seen nude pictures and videos of their mother and men on her computer. The husband is always going to be a suspect. So the very next day, on December 6th, Clay went with the detectives to retrace his steps the day of the murder. Then, Clay gave a more detailed explanation of how his car stalled that morning, the text messages that were sent back and forth, and how the kids ended up at his home. He said he woke up around 7 a.m., drove his 1988 Toyota Tercel around to warm it up before picking up the kids from Channon's and taking them to school. He showed them where the vehicle had stalled. It was near the golf course on North High Desert Drive, which I'm showing you here. So he texted Channon, asking her to please take the kids to school. Clay had decided it was better to keep his car on the street at the moment and then come back in the afternoon when the temperature was warmer. Clay explained to the police that he walked back and forth between his car and his house twice during the day, using the same sidewalk and route. Right after the car broke down, he walked home and went to bed to nap. After he walked home, Clay told Detective Johnson and Ricketts that his phone battery had died, causing him to turn it off. Since he was a night owl, he usually drove the children to school and then returned home to nap, so he left his phone off so that he wouldn't be disturbed. He had still been experiencing terrible back pain that would keep him up all night. Clay couldn't remember how long he slept, but he said he woke up around 11. A man returned to the car to try to start it again, but it was still dead, so he walked back home. To pass the time, he played Call of Duty on his Xbox. However, Clay was using offline mode, so there was no way for detectives to verify exactly what time he was doing that. Then, Clay said after he was done playing Call of Duty, he picked up his tools and rags and worked on his car. He went back out there. Clay said he spent the entire day working on the carburetor, walking to the car, and playing Xbox. Because his phone was off all day, Clay explained he had missed the text messages from Channon asking him to pick the children up from school at 3:17. But eventually, he said, the car started working, and he went home. Now, of course, they're trying to establish an alibi. This is what they do with everyone. So they asked him, "Did anyone see you during this time?" He said, "I don't know if anyone had." By this account, Clay was within 1.5 blocks from Channon's place several times that day. But none of his fingerprints matched any at the crime scene, and Clay did not have a criminal record. During the interview, Clay again told the detectives that they should focus on Channon's computer or her phone. He was convinced that someone Channon had met over the internet was responsible for her murder. Clay was then free to leave after the second interview, and the investigators followed his lead and started to investigate Channon's online dating history while they were still gathering evidence and having it analyzed. Channon's funeral was held at 1 p.m. on Saturday, December 10, 2011, at the Riverside Chapel Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the town of Chattaroy in Washington. Channon's friends and acquaintances from her children's school, the church, her dental school, and the broader community turned out to pay their respects. Also in attendance, of course, was Clay. He was there with his kids, and everyone was trying to support them, going through this incredible loss. Afterward, Channon's body was then returned to Florida, where Clay, her children, and her family laid her to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery in Orlando. She was remembered as a wonderful mother who supported her children in all of their endeavors. Channon's eulogy was read by her friend Doug Carter, who described Channon as a mother and community activist, stating that she was an outstanding woman. Doug said Channon's loved ones were allowing law enforcement to do their jobs, and they were all there to support and love on Channon's children. When Channon's funeral was held, Clay told the media that his only concern was getting his children through the upcoming holidays, which I could only imagine would be completely devastating. I'm sure there were constant reminders of Channon everywhere. So, let me go back to the days right after Channon's murder. I want to tell you everything they found. Detectives Johnson and Ricketts searched her cell phone for any recent communications to track down her killer. By this time, they were confident that Channon knew her killer. However, there were still a lot of people to speak to, and this information didn't necessarily point to one specific suspect. Police were sifting through a ton of information. They had actually been receiving calls from men saying they'd recently spoken to Channon online or had even gone on dates with her. It was encouraging, and the police had more potential people of interest to look at. But not every man that Channon had met or chatted with was making contact, which was a concern. When detectives went through Channon's cell phone, they could see that on December 1st, between 8:06 and 8:47 a.m., she was texting back and forth with a man named Tom Walker. The pair had met online and had a lunch date 4 weeks earlier. Then they had a dinner date scheduled for December 5th at Tom's house. But of course, that would never happen because Channon would be murdered. There were a number of flirtatious, I'm calling them flirtatious, that's very PG, messages going back and forth between Channon and the men she was texting, and one of them caught their eye. And there's a reason for that. Only hours before Channon's death, the messages that were exchanged were sexually explicit. In one of Tom's messages, he requested that Channon send him a very graphic photo of herself, in a very specific way that he wanted her to pose with a sex toy in a very suggestive manner. And while Channon never actually sent this picture to Tom, her killer posed her dead body in the exact same way. The detectives didn't know what this connection meant, but they were interested in talking to Tom Walker. When Channon and Clay separated, her friends, Summer Starks, encouraged her to try online dating because Channon was lonely. All she had was her kids and going to school, and her friends wanted to see her thrive. Her online dating life was the opposite of what she experienced in her daily life. During her dates, Channon kinda let loose. She wasn't exhibiting her motherly persona, she was free of responsibility. So, let's just say she was having a little fun. I told you this is the first time she was independent in a very long time, and she was ready to just let her hair down, so to speak. She had her profile on several dating websites, and she was looking for someone intelligent with whom she could have a great conversation. Among the men who caught Channon's eye was this car salesman, Tom Walker. She was impressed by Tom. She thought he was a catch. He was honest and open with her, and soon they set up that date and met 3 weeks before Channon's death. They traded a lot of sexually charged and very flirtatious text messages before and after meeting in person. Because Tom Walker's number was already stored in Channon's cell phone, finding him was relatively easy. When the detectives informed Tom that they needed to speak with him, he agreed and met with them on December 4th. Investigators were obviously very interested in Tom's movements days prior and whether he had an alibi on the day of her murder. Tom told Detective Ricketts that on December 1st, he left work around 9:40 EO, attend a funeral in Spokane Valley, about 28 miles from Deer Park. He left the funeral at 10:30 in the morning, returning to work around 11 o'clock. 20 minutes later, he texted Channon asking how her day was and telling her he had just gotten back from the funeral at 12:10 p.m. Channon replied, saying that she had to stop by the bank, and she asked Tom if he would like to meet her for lunch that day at 1 o'clock at a restaurant in town called The Onion. But Tom had to be at work at that time, so he declined that invitation. Around 12 p.m., there must have been some miscommunication or crosswires because at 12:19, Channon texted Tom, asking if he was on his way for lunch. 5 minutes later, he again said that he wasn't going to be able to make it, and he never heard back from Channon after that. But what if Tom had come to Channon's after this, and maybe they got into an argument that resulted in Tom killing her? Well, despite sending Channon the text asking her to pose in a certain way, Tom denied involvement in her brutal murder. He explained that he had been exchanging text messages like this back and forth with her for weeks. He did say that the fact that Channon asked him to go to lunch, considering they already had a date set for December 5th, was odd, especially because Channon knew that Tom had to work that day. As part of their investigation, detectives collected DNA samples from Tom Walker, checked his cell phone records, and called his boss to confirm his alibi. Everything was confirmed. Tom Walker's phone records did not place him near Channon's house on the day of her murder. Therefore, until the DNA could be analyzed and compared to the scene, detectives had to look at other leads. Again, they didn't know exactly what time Channon died, so no one could be excluded as a suspect. During their investigation into Channon's life, the detectives discovered several messages and calls from a man on December 1st, who was listed in her phone as John Wilson. Investigators initially had a very difficult time identifying who this John person was. To begin with, his Facebook profile was not him. He was definitely catfishing. It belonged to a doctor in New York City. When they did a reverse image search, they saw that this doctor had a practice in New York. So someone was using his picture and talking to Channon on Instant Messenger, and even on Yahoo, under an account called Just Wondering, 006 hours, 120 minutes, and 220 seconds. He used the username Just Wondering 06 on his dating profiles, so already that's a little suspicious. Based on Channon's message exchanges with John Wilson, the detectives were able to see that the two were planning to meet on Thursday, December 1st. That's the last day anyone had heard from Channon. So detectives were definitely intrigued when they discovered that John was supposed to meet with her on the day she died. They immediately tried to track him down for questioning. Channon had met this John Wilson person on a dating site a few months before she was murdered, back in September 2011. The two soon began a sexual relationship. When they first began dating, John made it clear that he wasn't looking for anything serious, and Channon was fine with that. She was fresh out of a long-term relationship that had been kind of tumultuous, and she was ready to have some fun. Upon looking through Channon's phone records, the detective discovered that John Wilson always called Channon from a public payphone. In addition to that, he would use a library computer every time he messaged her on the dating profile. So this was definitely another red flag that he was reaching out to Channon through untraceable numbers and computers. Detectives decided to message John from Channon's dating profile. Instead of pretending they were her or anything, they just told John that they were detectives from the Spokane County Sheriff's Department and they needed to question him about Channon's Starbuck. Within 20 minutes, a message came in from Just Wondering 06 username. First, he told the detectives that John Wilson was not his name, but he didn't want to disclose his true identity. Because of his behavior, the detectives were even more suspicious of this man, and they needed to know who he was to investigate his involvement in Channon's murder. So what they did was take one of those incoming calls from Channon's phone and traced it back to a payphone at a university library. On the library's CCTV, they saw a man entering the building not long before this call was placed. That was their John. But why was he hiding behind a fake picture online and a fake name? To make things even more difficult, John had gotten a lawyer as soon as he heard about Channon's murder, and he wasn't talking. He refused to meet with officers until they threatened to go public with his photo from the CCTV footage. They said, "Well, just wait until someone comes forward who recognizes you." After some consideration, this man agreed to meet with the detectives at his attorney's office on December 17th. Sure enough, the guy who came in looked nothing like the profile picture. But we already knew that. However, his name was really John. It was just not John Wilson. It was John Kenline. They also learned that he was a high school teacher, and he was married, but he was lying to Channon and saying he was single. This is also why he didn't want to come forward, because he was cheating on his wife. John told police that he had been intimate with Channon about a half a dozen times, including twice at her home, but that he had no intention of making their relationship public or dating her seriously. It was clear that John had catfished Channon, and honestly, it was not clear to the investigators why she remained in a relationship with him. Channon's family suspected that this was because she always was so accepting of people and she would see the good qualities in them. But John Kenline had more concerning information to share with the police. He told them that he had stopped by Channon's house on the day that she was last seen. Not only did John stop by Channon's house once, but he visited her several times on December 1st. Now that's even more suspicious, and why hadn't he come forward? I mean, I understand the infidelity and the hiding of your identity, but if you find out that someone has been murdered and you don't come forward, that can definitely raise some red flags. John explained that he and Channon had plans to meet the morning of December 1st. He arranged to actually take the day off work after leaving his house around 9 a.m. John took his kids to school, bought some coffee at Starbucks in North Spokane, and then drove to Deer Park, arriving at Channon's house at 10:30 a.m. He told the police he knocked on the door a few times, but when no one answered, he went to a payphone nearby where he tried calling Channon. So John told them he returned to Channon's a second time. He walked the perimeter of her house, and he knew where her bedroom window was. So he went into the backyard and checked for things like lights and if a fan was running in the bathroom, but she was nowhere to be seen. and the house was completely closed up, with the blinds drawn. John said he left, drove to Deer Park Library, and then headed back home, but he did stop at Whitworth University. It was there that he used one of the public computers at 12:17 p.m. instant message Channon from his Yahoo account, checking to see if everything was okay. Channon messaged him back from her phone at 12:37, telling John she had been eating and asking, "Did you stop by?" John told her he had come there that morning and asked if she was going to be home soon. The message that Channon sent back seemed straightforward enough, but John said he had a weird feeling about it. I mean, all she said is like, "Did you stop by?" But he said it wasn't her usual self. She was kind of jovial and playful and pleasant, and for some reason, it just caught his attention. John said he texted her again asking if he could see her that night around 10:30 p.m. At 1:17 p.m., Channon replied saying, "No, not tonight. I have a headache and I will have Clay take the kids." John responded asking her, "Well, what about closer to 9:30? Channon texted back at 1:32 p.m. saying, "Nope." So John went to go get some lunch around 2 p.m. and then told the investigators he went home about 90 minutes later before heading back out to go to several places, one of which was taking his son for a haircut. These movements were all corroborated by receipts that John provided. That night, at 8 p.m., he dropped his daughter off at basketball practice and used a phone at his daughter's school to call Channon, but he didn't get an answer, so John went back home before heading to Channon's once again, arriving at 10:30 p.m. The house was just in darkness. However, this time he could hear the heat running. He knocked on the door, but he didn't get an answer. The doorknob was locked. So John tried calling Channon from a payphone once again, but when she didn't pick up, he drove back towards his house, where he bought drain cleaner just before midnight at Walmart. In total, John had come to Channon's about 4 times that day. Though at first, they did have this theory that it was possible that Channon might have threatened to tell his wife that he was cheating and that she was going to try to blackmail him. But the thing was, Channon didn't even know that John was married. Because they didn't have a solid time of death for Channon, they could not confirm whether John was telling the truth about where he was and what he did on December 1st. At that moment, the detectives considered John the most promising suspect. Ironically, his alibi for that morning was that he was ordering a coffee at Starbucks. I'm sure you see the irony there. The last name. The detectives, however, were not convinced that John was innocent. What would stop a man from lying to police if he was willing to cheat and lie to his family and have this double life? But at this point, they didn't have anything concrete to hold him. So after collecting DNA samples from John, the detectives let him go. So far, DNA samples were obtained from Clay Starbuck, John, and Tom Walker. While waiting for DNA test results from the state crime lab, detectives went back to scrutinizing Channon's phone records. When her outgoing call records were received by detectives a couple of weeks after her death, Detective Lyle Johnston found something that shed a whole new light on the murder. At 9:18 a.m. on December 1st, Channon had called the Spokane County 911. This was not in her outgoing call log on her actual cell phone, as though it had been deleted off of her device. Detective Johnson and Rickett contacted the 911 dispatcher immediately, and they were able to find a recording of Channon's 911 call that had gone completely unnoticed until this point. Wow. The call only lasted about 30 seconds, but the operator couldn't hear anything intelligible, only a short, high-pitched, guttural sound that sounded like a woman followed by a rustling noise.
911, what are you reporting? Hello?
The call then ended abruptly, so the operator called back the number right away, but it went to voicemail, indicating that the cell phone had been turned off.
Hi, this is Shannon. Please leave a message.
However, according to GPS, the phone was at Channon's residence when this 911 call was made. Investigators could see that someone had tried to delete the record of the call. Afterward, as the detectives were listening to the recording of this 911 call, the shuffling sounded like a struggle, and then that grunt from the female sounded like she was in distress. And then there was just silence. This was the very last call that came from Channon's phone. Detective Johnson just jumped out of his seat and yelled, She called 911. This was an incredible moment for him, and of course, for this entire case. Since Channon was murdered, the detectives were working on the assumption that she died within 24 hours. They didn't know the precise time that she had been murdered, only that it happened between December 1st and December 2nd. However, the fact that Channon called 911 gave them a better idea of when she died. In light of this new evidence, the detectives determined that Channon had been murdered shortly after returning home from dropping her children off at school around 9:18 a.m. when that phone call was made. So this meant then any other activity from her phone after this couldn't have been Channon. Her killer must have sent text messages to deceive people into believing that she was still alive. With this new 911 information, it was clear that Channon couldn't have been the one texting Logan and Clay later that afternoon from her cell phone, because she was dead. The detectives had a new potential time of death for her, and whoever had Channon's cell phone must have been familiar with her and her family, because, remember, she used a family nickname for her son, Marshall. She called him Marsh. Someone turned Channon's cell phone back on at 12:05 p.m., and from that time until 4 p.m. that day, 11 text messages were sent from her phone, and she received 99 messages. The last text from her phone was sent at 3:17 p.m. when she asked Clay to go pick up the kids from school because she had a headache. That wasn't her texting. What this meant was that the text message to Tom Walker, remember him? Inviting him over to meet that day meant that it came from the killer. Some of the text messages between Tom's and Channon's cell phones were deleted from Channon's phone, but they remained in Tom's message history. Remember, Tom even said it was odd that Channon wanted to meet because they had a date planned for a few days later. But I know you're probably also wondering if there was something else that should have happened in terms of the 911 operator. Why didn't they take further action? Why didn't they send police over there? But I did explain that they tried to call Channon back. Protocol dictated that the next step after the operator called back but got no response was to call again a second time. At that point, if no one answered, they were supposed to forward this to the sheriff's dispatch for a follow-up. Tragically, this did not happen because only one callback was ever made. In this case, inexperience couldn't be blamed because the person who took that 911 call had been working as an operator for 17 years. They should have known. The communications center classified hang-up calls as either a Phase 1 or a Phase 2. Phase 1 calls give the operator the caller's number and the nearest cell tower. Phase 2 gives the number plus the coordinates of GPS at the time of the call. Channon's call was a Phase 2. They would have known exactly where this call was coming from, and this meant that officers could have been sent over there right away. However, what is interesting is that there was a follow-up news story about this, and the 911 Communication Center's policy was quoted, saying that even if an operator calls a hang-up back twice and no one picks up, law enforcement doesn't have to respond. It's almost like a case-by-case scenario. The reason for this is that they received dozens of hang-up calls every hour, meaning that they would have to send an officer all over the place, which would be pretty hard to do. The communications center concluded that the breach of protocol was an isolated incident and that the operator would not be fired because other than this, they had an exemplary record. However, in light of what happened in Channon's case, the communications center decided to have a refresher course on hang-up calls. But it doesn't help with what happened to Channon. It did help with a timeline. After establishing Channon's time of death, Detective Johnson and Rickett re-examined John Canline's alibi. While Tom Walker's alibi had been confirmed by his boss and the guests at the funeral he attended, John still had to be verified. The police went into that Starbucks where John said that he ordered his coffee on December 1st. Luckily for John, when the detectives looked at the Starbucks records, they saw that he ordered a coffee at 9:50 a.m., and a barista remembered him. There was not enough time for John to kill Channon, stage the scene, and then drive all the way from Deer Park to that Starbucks and be there at 9:50 a.m. So John was now cleared as a suspect in Channon's murder. With John out of the way and Tom Walker's alibi confirmed as well, along with Channon's two oldest sons, Austin and Blake, being at school, the detectives returned to the drawing board. As they probed further into Channon's personal life, the detectives discovered something else that was pretty alarming. Several of her friends told the detectives that Clay had been nothing but trouble for Channon. Well, that's not unusual. They were going through a divorce, and co-parenting is not easy. But the people close to Channon went on to say that there had been incidents around Channon's house where she came home and found things kind of off. Channon didn't feel safe in her own home. Between June and November 2011, she filed 4 reports with the sheriff's deputies. One time, Channon came home and saw that her lamps had been tampered with. Some of the light bulbs were unscrewed in places like her garage, and her barbecue was tipped over on her porch. Another time, she noticed that someone had tampered with the truck she was borrowing from her friend Summer. Summer was shocked when she learned that Channon had been struggling financially and had almost been evicted, had her electricity turned off, and her car repossessed. So Summer allowed Channon to borrow her truck for shopping and taking the kids places. However, a few days after Channon borrowed the truck, she had to apologize profusely to Summer, sounding heartbroken. Channon told Summer that she had been outside and saw that the windows of Summer's truck were smashed. Channon also thought someone was stealing things like jewelry and even a handgun. She was so paranoid that while she was away, she would put tape on the doors to check if they were still there when she got home. Wanting to keep herself and her kids as safe as she could, Channon ended up changing the locks and installed a video surveillance camera in the kitchen to catch whoever was breaking in. When she did change the locks, she didn't give her keys to anyone, including her children, because she wasn't sure who was doing it, and she suspected it could even be her ex-husband, Clay. She was so afraid that if it was Clay, he would get a key from their kids and make a copy. Only Channon's landlord had the key to this house. So on the day of the murder, the security cameras were missing from her home, and detectives speculated that whoever killed Channon may have taken these cameras. Detectives wanted to take a second look at Clay, since several items of evidence indicated that Clay and Channon's relationship had deteriorated further than anyone had known. The detectives obtained Channon's divorce filings, as well as her diary, to examine. First of all, the decree of dissolution of their marriage also included a restraining order against Clay that would remain in effect until August 2012, just a couple of months before Channon's murder. In October, the judge actually ordered Clay to pay her over $9,000 in back child support and attorney's fees. At the same court hearing, the judge entitled Channon to 50% of Clay's pension. There were a number of letters that were part of Channon and Clay's divorce records, and one letter from their 12-year-old daughter was in that filing. She said she was unhappy living with her mom and had a close relationship with her dad. She referred to the relationship with her father as, quote, the best relationship ever, end quote, that they were 2 peas in a pod and she wanted to move in with Clay. In turn, there was a letter from Clay to the court claiming Channon was jealous of the relationship that he had with their children. But from all accounts, this wasn't true at all. Channon was completely devastated that her second attempt at trying to keep her family together by being with Clay again had failed. At the same time, she could feel her children were pulling away from her. Channon knew her ex-husband was saying terrible things to their children in an attempt to turn them against her, but she never responded in kind. Channon wanted her kids to have a relationship with their father, even if he was nasty and vindictive toward Channon herself. There was a diary entry from September 2011 where she wrote, quote, Marshall was upset after spending the day with his father. Marshall said his father showed him a couple of pictures from my phone. One was a picture his father told him was me, naked from the waist up. Marshall said his dad put his finger over the breasts, but his father told him that I had sent this picture to men. Marshall said he didn't like me, and everything was my fault because I was divorcing his dad. End quote. I think it is a little weird that Clay is claiming and even showing their son nude pictures that she supposedly sent to people. That's a little strange. Then there was a diary entry from September 5th, and it stated, quote, Marshall and Serena spent the weekend with Clay and came home not wanting to talk to me. Marshall acted as though something was wrong, I asked him if everything was all right, and he replied with, "I don't like you." End quote. Based on Channon's diary entries, the detectives concluded that the separation was not as smooth as Clay described in his interviews. Clay had said that things were perfectly amicable between the pair, but it's clear that the seeds of resentment and parental alienation on his part were being sown, according to what Channon shared in her personal diary. But Clay insisted that he did everything he could to make things work. It's convenient that now Channon isn't around to tell her side of the story. So Detective Johnson and Rickett reviewed Clay's story from December 1st. Once again, they requested Clay's cell phone records from the provider and began going back to speak with those close to Channon, specifically asking them if there was anything suspicious they noticed about Clay. Let's start with the interviews. A friend of Channon's named Christy Levy, who didn't know Clay that well, took food over for the kids on December 4th. After a while, Clay asked Christy to follow him into a bedroom. Clay told her that Channon's death was not a surprise, saying, quote, "You didn't know Channon, and it was expected because she was dating lots of people, and she was engaged in promiscuity. She was online dating. She was having multiple relations," end quote. Needless to say, Christy was taken aback by what Clay had been saying. As we know, it is true she was seeing various men. However, Channon's neighbor, Lana McKay, told police that on the afternoon before Channon's body was discovered, she hadn't seen anything unusual. Instead, she said that Clay approached her at a grocery store, and it was like he had been looking for her. Clay came up to Lana and explained he was concerned that something happened to Channon, which Lana thought was a little strange, as she had never spoken to Clay before. At that moment, a horrible feeling came over her that Clay had done something to Channon. That is weird, but it's still only circumstantial. Then, 2 days later, on December 12th, at a school event, Clay again approached Channon's neighbor, Lana. During their conversation, Clay talked to her for at least a full 5 minutes about how Channon was unfaithful, going into detail about how their kids had caught her having an online affair when he was away in Alaska when they were together. Now I know that 5 minutes doesn't seem that long, but when someone is talking about something that makes you feel uncomfortable and seems completely inappropriate, we know that those 5 minutes can feel like an eternity. So again, Lana left this conversation feeling extremely unsettled and like Clay knew more than he was letting on. Then Channon's friends Doug and Janine told detectives that they also went to Clay's house when they heard the news of Channon's murder. While there, Clay invited Doug into a bedroom to speak to him privately, just like he had done with Christy. The conversation the men had was described to the investigators as Doug feeling surreal. Clay told Doug that Channon was promiscuous and said that he had been trying to help her for some time now. Clay also told Doug that Marshall wasn't his biological son. With Doug recalling that, Clay tried to portray Channon as some kind of sexual deviant. Doug found this conversation to be very bizarre, given Channon's body had been found that day. He didn't believe a word Clay was saying, and it seemed really suspicious. It does seem even more strange that, in the wake of Channon's murder, Clay was adamant about making her look like a bad person. Finally, the detectives obtained Clay's phone records. These records revealed that his phone had been turned off at 8:08 a.m., just after he texted Channon to say he'd need her to take the kids to school. It is interesting because remember when he said, "Oh, I realized my phone was off." I thought that was odd right away, and I'm sure you did as well. Who turns their phone off? I understand maybe he didn't want to be bothered because he needed to get a nap, but there is such a thing as silencing your phone. Well, the records show it was off until 3:37 p.m., which Clay told the detectives was because of a dead battery. Later that night, after Blake's basketball game at 9:06 p.m., he texted Channon saying, "Logan is pissed and we didn't see you at the game. You should be involved in your child's activities." When detectives studied Clay's cell phone activity over the past year, they found that his phone had never been off as long as it was on the day of Channon's murder. This is so interesting. I love when they backtrack like this and say, yeah, this is unusual. According to these records, Clay never had text messages that he didn't respond to in a timely fashion, and it never sat idle for a long period of time. Although these call records were suspect, they were only a piece of a much bigger puzzle, and investigators still had a lot of research to do. Additionally, the detectives were still waiting for those DNA results from the crime lab. Throughout this time, Clay was in constant contact with the investigators in an attempt to be as helpful as he could. He continued to provide information about Channon and all of her casual relationships, saying that he hoped law enforcement would apprehend one of the men who he was sure killed Channon. However, detectives were struck by how much interest Clay had in his ex-wife's romantic attachments. It went beyond the usual level that you would expect, especially because none of these men had even been introduced to Channon's children, and therefore they had no involvement in their life. So it wasn't really a co-parenting thing. The detectives started to believe that no one except Clay had motivation to use what he knew about Channon's private life to his advantage, especially if he wanted to shift the focus of the investigation away from himself and onto others. When he showed up during the crime scene processing, it was like he was trying to get information from the police. Detective Renz already had suspicions from that point on that Clay was trying to throw off the investigation. Channon had also confided in her family back in Florida about her concerns. They were so far away, but Channon had considered packing up and moving the kids back to Florida for good. She didn't want to be selfish because she knew that her children would be unhappy being away from their friends and their community. So Channon's family tried to always be there by phone, providing counseling and support in any way they could. Channon's friends from school tried to offer her support as well because sometimes she would be brought to tears because of the things she was dealing with. One time, Channon confided in her school friends that Clay had sent her a very odd gift. It was a sex toy. He left it on the front porch in a gift bag. Channon came into class crying that day and told one of her friends the note that he left said something like, "If I can't have you, you can have this." Yeah, that is very odd. Summer Stark, Channon's friend, said in interviews that Channon confided in her that she was afraid for her safety around Clay. Summer reassured her that Clay would never hurt her. But now Summer was rethinking her feelings about Channon's ex-husband. Channon had repeatedly urged her mother that if anything were ever to happen to her, they should have Clay investigated. Well, now he was being thoroughly investigated. On Channon's cell phone records, police found threatening text messages from Clay from late August to mid-September. Things like, "Well, thank you, you stupid bitch. You gave me a 3-day notice on $5,000. We will need to talk on how to recover. You just keep jerking guys off, Channon, and you alienated 4 of your 5 kids. Let's talk." Another text said, "Instead of doing what's right and what the kids would like, you're more concerned with trying to screw me. But you hurt them, and they don't like you for it. They love being with and seeing me. Can't you see that you're a deadbeat mom? You have no concern for how money is made. You just take, and I give. I'm trying." These aren't very nice, but they were going through a divorce, and they're also not that out of the ordinary for people going through a contentious separation. But instead of just making efforts to repay Channon what she was owed, as per the court order, Clay would send these angry text messages to his ex-wife. At the same time, he would insist to the police that he didn't mind having to pay her. He wasn't bitter about the court's decision, but from what they could tell in the messages, he was pissed off about the custody arrangements. He was demanding to have more time with his younger children and how they were raised. So things were really far from amicable. Clay seemed obsessed with his ex-wife and her romantic life. Prior to the murder, Clay had used every opportunity he could to unnecessarily and maliciously spread information to multiple people in their community about Channon's private life, whether it was true or not. Back in April, he actually complained to their dentist and fellow church member about Channon dating lots of men online. He also told this doctor that he had placed a device on Channon's laptop to track her keystrokes. Yep. This way, Clay could monitor every website. It was interesting. I was wondering how he knew all the different dating sites she went to, even though this wasn't something he said he normally talked to her about. Channon herself later confided in the same dentist that she was afraid of Clay. She thought that he would harm her to get out of paying child support. Channon said she even knew that Clay had installed that spyware on her laptop and that she tried to have it removed. In one text to Clay, Channon made it clear that she knew what he was doing, saying, You came in my house, you stole my rings, among other things. You put a keylogger on my computer, you are capable of anything. She had already confided in one of her instructors at the dental course that she feared Clay would kill her. She had also been open with many of her friends at church, fearing for her life. She didn't know what he was capable of. On November 21, Clay and Channon attended a parent-teacher conference for Marshall. Remember, he mentioned that was the last time he saw her when Channon headed off to a book fair. After the meeting, Clay told Marshall's teacher, Meredith Pearson, that he was concerned about Channon's dating activities and how the kids hated her. But then Clay said something even more shocking when he told Meredith, "I wouldn't be surprised if we found her dead. I wouldn't be surprised if we found her with her throat slit open." It seemed to everyone that Clay was hyper-focused on Channon's safety and this perceived risk of her online dating activities. The case against Clay being the person who did this was entirely circumstantial, but it was very compelling. He had both the motive and the opportunity, and he knew enough about Channon's routine to prevent the discovery of her body for at least 2 days. During an interview in January of 2012 with Detective Ricketts, Clay was visibly nervous, and his hands were shaking when they asked him what he was wearing the day of his ex-wife's murder. Still, he totally rejected the idea that his ex-wife was scared of him. Instead, he claimed she was scared of other men that she was seeing, but she couldn't tell anyone because she was so promiscuous and she didn't want anyone to know. Well, that's when the detectives decided to look at that route that Clay said he took from his house to his vehicle on the day it broke down on December 1st. According to Clay, he walked a certain route twice to and from his broken-down vehicle. Well, when they searched this route, they found out there were video cameras. The footage was provided to them, and they reviewed it a number of times. They were stunned by what they found, or what they didn't find. There was no sign of Clay at all. You'll recall that DNA swabs from Channon's autopsy had been taken for testing to be compared to John Tom as well as Clay. Investigators had also taken DNA from Channon's 2 older sons, Austin and Blake. As a matter of routine, they weren't seriously being considered as suspects. The type of testing conducted for this was something called YSTR. This identifies DNA consistent with the paternal side of a contributor's family through the Y chromosome, which is only present in males. The downside of this test is that it can't narrow the results down to a specific male, only men in a certain paternal line. So, it's really only suitable for excluding someone as a DNA contributor. I know this is confusing, but Channon's autopsy revealed she had fought for her life against her attacker. When the results came back in late January to early February, they were complex but telling. The swabs taken from Channon's neck and right-hand fingernails showed DNA profiles from 2 different contributors. The major contributor was consistent with males on Clay's side of the family. But there was another unknown male contributor to the DNA on Channon's neck. The swabs from Channon's face showed a partial profile matching, again, Clay's paternal bloodline. But because Clay, Blake, and Austin didn't live with Channon, there was no reason for their DNA to be anywhere on her body, let alone on that day. In those 3 areas, they were most likely touched by the killer in the attack. The only male who lived with Channon was her son, Marshall, who didn't have the same DNA profile as the ones found on her body. As Clay suspected, it was confirmed through further DNA testing that Marshall was not Clay's biological son. Wow. So there was another reason that Clay may resent Channon. Swabs were taken from Channon's vaginal area, which showed the presence of semen. It's pretty obvious the DNA came from either Clay or someone on his paternal line. While his son Austin was working, his boss confirmed that he was there all day. Then Blake was at school, and his attendance was confirmed by the principal. So this just left Clay, whose DNA was not only found on Channon's body, but whose alibi was flimsy. He seemed unhinged when it came to being obsessive about Channon being with other men. So the detectives were convinced that they knew what happened to Channon on December 1st. They believe Clay texted her to ask her to take their 3 youngest children to school that morning. But they think that Clay lied about his car not working to get Channon out of her house. While Channon was out driving the kids to school, they believe that Clay somehow snuck into Channon's house and was lying in wait for her to arrive back home. When Channon returned from dropping the children off at school, the detectives think that Clay had attacked her. During this attack, Channon attempted to call for 911. But during the struggle, the phone call ended because Clay gained control over Channon's phone and turned it off. And that is when the murder occurred. Clay strangled Channon to death and then positioned her body to humiliate her, but also to be consistent with Tom Walker's message. So Clay posed her body in the exact way that Tom Walker requested. Detectives believe Clay used Channon's phone to try to frame John and Tom for Channon's murder by trying to place them at the crime scene. Clay pretended to be Channon by texting people so that it seemed like she was still alive long after she had already died. The detectives believe that Clay had planned out a significant amount of premeditation. Anyone that would plan something so calculating and so terrible to a human being, especially to the mother of their children, deserved a life sentence. On February 6th, Clay was arrested for first-degree murder and second-degree burglary. After picking him up, detectives took him to the police station to speak with him. During his almost 5-hour interview, he repeatedly denied killing Channon. He claimed his DNA was only in the house because he used to live there and that he and Channon had been intimate following their divorce. He said he had been in Channon's home several times before her murder because his 3 children lived there. However, he had no explanation for how his genetic material had been found under Channon's fingernails and on her body the day she was found dead. In his first interview, Clay could not stop talking about Channon's sex life. But in this interview, Clay was silent when it came to that aspect of her life. He told detectives he didn't have any scratches or bruises, so how could Channon have scratched him? The detectives took photos of Clay and his hands on the day of the murder, and one of the detectives recalled that he saw a small wound on Clay's right hand and on his forehead. For some unknown reason, this was never noted. At Clay's first court appearance, the day following his arrest, he was appointed a public defender, and bail was set at $1 million. He was also barred from contacting his children, who were sent to stay with a family friend. When they executed a search warrant for Clay's house, detectives seized multiple items, including Channon's photo ID. That was found in Clay's locked walk-in closet, along with a computer hard drive that was labeled Channon's desktop computer. They also collected a notebook, handwritten notes, thumb drives, a woman's watch, 3 Xbox consoles, and documents in a backpack, including a number of divorce papers and printed emails between Channon and another man. However, they also noticed something else. Inside this closet was Channon's death certificate, and it wasn't just lying on the ground or shoved in a corner. To police, it looked like it was on display, propped up on a shelf, almost like how Channon's body had been propped up. It's just morbid. 2 days later, on February 9th, Clay was charged with 1 count of aggravated first-degree murder and 5 aggravating factors, including the murder being committed during the course of a burglary and in violation of Channon's protection order. He was additionally charged with 1 count of sexually violating human remains. At the time, a conviction for aggravated murder carried the penalty of life imprisonment or death. These days, the death penalty is no longer in effect in Washington state. In 2018, the Washington Supreme Court unanimously declared the death penalty unconstitutional, and in 2023, it was signed out of state law. But back in 2012, it was still in place, and the previous execution was only in 2010. Fortunately for Clay, if he were convicted, he wouldn't be sent to death row. Because the prosecutors were not seeking the death penalty, Clay and Channon's 5 children remained supportive of their father, believing he was innocent of murdering their mother. They described their father as loving, caring, and kind. In an interview, Clay and Channon's youngest son, Marshall, said, "Why would you kill your ex-wife that you still love and leave your 5 children parentless?" He wasn't really questioning his father, who's actually not even his biological father. He was making a hypothetical statement. Why would somebody do this? The children, seeing their father accused of such a horrific act, were baffled. The Starbuck children claimed their mother, Channon, wasn't always who she seemed. According to Channon's children, they knew that she slept with many different men. She was promiscuous. Channon's oldest son, Austin, even said that it was just part of who she was. She was addicted to seeing men. Channon's children also said that Clay always took her back and always saw the best in her, even after they got divorced. Their oldest children, Austin and Blake, told the news station that Channon would leave early in the morning and return later at night, and the neighbors were even worried about the safety of the 3 youngest children. They also believed that the police were trying to frame their father. They said that after reading the arrest affidavit, they both laughed out loud. It really seemed like, especially with the older children, that they were really going to bat for their father. They did not believe he did this, and they were questioning everything. They said he was telling the truth, he was providing all this information, and they even questioned the DNA. They said it would be different if it was saliva, semen, or sweat, but that their dad lived there until months before this happened. Channon's family, on the other hand, felt very differently about Clay's arrest. Seeing Channon's murderer behind bars greatly relieved her mother and siblings. According to her brother Stephen, Channon was not someone who sat back and let others control her life. She was a fighter, and she fought until her last breath. As for the younger children, we know Austin was working at this time, but his siblings were all still in school, and Logan had special needs. There was no way that Austin's income was enough to support himself and 4 other children. Sadly, because Channon wasn't working at the time, and Clay had been fired from his job soon after the arrest, this meant that the children wouldn't receive any death benefits. Friends of the family rallied around and held fundraisers to establish a trust fund for the children. Channon's brother Stephen and his wife Angela, who lived in Florida, did seek permission from the court to take custody of Logan, Serena, and Marshall. He wanted to protect Channon's younger children from the publicity of this case and the additional pain and anguish they would feel. However, Stephen ultimately withdrew his custody application because Austin was also seeking custody of his siblings. Austin wanted to keep his family together and be there for them as a big brother, and Austin was eventually appointed as the siblings' legal guardian. In late August 2012, while Clay was awaiting trial, his ex-wife, who we're going to call Candace for privacy reasons, contacted detectives to give them some background on her marriage to Clay. Her insights into his behavior revealed a lot about the kind of person Clay was. Even prior to marrying Channon, Candace was honest that she had no grudges against her ex-husband. They were high school sweethearts, but she'd moved on with her life since the divorce. However, during their marriage, things had not been good. They were quite rocky. Candace told the police that Clay had been unfaithful on multiple occasions and that she felt he had an addiction to adult material. Starts with a P, ends with ography, which he would leave all over their house. She also claimed that he was almost let go from his job for sending inappropriate pictures over the internet. And he'd even tried to hit on one of Candace's friends, who was completely creeped out and scared by the entire interaction. But when Candace confronted Clay about his infidelity, he was cold, and he wouldn't even engage in a conversation about it. He liked to play mind games and took advantage of the fact that Candace was socially isolated when they were living in Alaska. Remember, Clay was also living in Alaska with Channon, and she felt the same way. But one of Clay's attractive qualities was that he could be incredibly charming. When Candace finally decided to leave the marriage for good, she moved with her 2 children out of state, and her mom helped to watch them and take care of them. But one day, while Candace's mom was watching the kids, Clay came and kidnapped them, taking them all the way back to Alaska. He called her an unfit mother and told her she would never see them again. So he had a history of making things very difficult for his exes. Even then, Clay always wanted to have the upper hand, and the last word he used, paying child support, was a way to exert control and power over Candace. She said that Clay's general attitude towards other people was that most of them were stupid, and he belittled anyone who didn't adhere to what he wanted. She specifically remembers him getting extremely angry when the court ordered him to pay Candace thousands of dollars in back child support. Does this sound familiar? His behavior resulted in his daughter not wanting anything to do with her father at all. But the most shocking thing Candace told investigators was that when she heard Clay had been arrested for Channon's murder, she wasn't surprised. In fact, she went so far as to say she wouldn't have been surprised if he were a serial killer. She felt like her ex-husband had no conscience and no issues with just doing whatever he wanted, especially out of spite. Candace told the police the only reason she was able to escape the marriage was that she moved in with her parents, who were also scared of Clay themselves. Candace didn't feel safe maintaining any contact, so she completely cut ties. In a recorded jailhouse conversation with his sister Kathy, Clay wanted her to pass on some information to one of his sons, which of course violated the no-contact order. But the investigation was continuing. You might have noticed I haven't mentioned much about what happened with Channon's laptop after they seized it, and that's because police didn't analyze it until April 12, 2013. But aside from some sexually explicit photos and videos of herself which Channon had sent to men online, there was nothing to indicate that Channon had been killed by anyone she met on those platforms. Investigators did find spyware installed on her computer. This was a keystroke program that Clay had installed. So that was true. He had been spying on her. The prosecutors planned to call all 5 children as witnesses for the state, but it was proving to be more challenging than they thought it would be. The 2 oldest children were refusing to cooperate. They thought their dad was 100% innocent. It's totally understandable. Their world had been destroyed. And what do you do when one of your primary caregivers has been ripped away from you forever? You cling to the remaining parent who's still alive. The last thing the Starbuck children wanted was to have both of their parents taken away. So in a sense I can sympathize with them. These are just unbelievable circumstances. But given how vocal Clay was both before and after the murder, publicly degrading Channon's character and ruining her reputation, it's more likely that the kids were exposed to this narrative. When you're young, you're impressionable. These things have an impact, especially when they're coming from a person you trust. And don't forget that the children themselves were apparently the ones who had seen these graphic images on Channon's computer. We don't know if they were snooping or if they were told to look at them by their father, or if Channon had just left her device somewhere and they accidentally stumbled upon them. Regardless of Channon's personal life, she loved her children to the end of the earth. And it's very unfortunate that Clay would tell the children and other people that she was a terrible mother and use this to influence his children's perspective of the situation. I want to end with what happened at Clay's trial. 48-year-old Clay Starbuck's trial finally got underway in May of 2013. Clay was unable to clarify what information he relied upon to support his belief that Channon's online dating made her susceptible to being murdered. At the time, around 49 million people across the country had tried online dating, so it wasn't uncommon. The court excluded a lot of information that would have been too prejudicial. Channon's mother, Melanie, and brother Stephen traveled from Florida to attend every day of the trial. Melanie positioned herself in the courtroom so that when Clay was led inside, he'd have no choice but to look at his former mother-in-law and see the contempt in her face. The prosecutor called over 70 witnesses. The state's case was that, months before the murder, Clay worked to create a picture of Channon living a lifestyle that placed her at risk of being harmed by the men she met online. He put the spyware application on Channon's computer. Clay knew that Channon had a date planned with John on the morning of her murder. Clay decided to kill his wife and then frame someone she was dating as the killer. So Clay faked his car trouble before walking to Channon's house. While she dropped the kids off at school, Clay gained access to the home and was waiting for Channon to return. During this prolonged attack and torture, Clay's DNA was left at the scene. During the struggle, Channon managed to call 911, but aside from emitting a split-second gasping sound, she was unable to speak, likely being incapacitated just after the operator picked up. The prosecution claimed that Clay turned Channon's phone off for a brief period before turning it back on and sending multiple text messages to Tom and John, giving the impression that Channon was still alive and continuing the same ruse with their children that afternoon. In terms of a motive, prosecutors claim that Clay was consumed by greed, anger, obsession, and jealousy over Channon moving on, dating other men, and pursuing Clay for outstanding child support. Channon's children were not in the courtroom as the jury was shown the graphic photos of their mother and the crime scene. The prosecution argued that Clay was the only person who could have known the context of the text messages on Channon's cell phone. The killer was familiar not only with Channon's life, but acted upon what they knew of Channon's life. The fact that Channon's body was posed in a way similar to the way that Tom had requested in the text messages proved not that Tom had committed the murder, but that whoever killed Channon had access to her phone. The court heard that Clay sent dozens of texts from Channon's phone that day in an attempt to learn who she was talking to. Clay's actions in providing information about Channon's personal life to police were not motivated by a genuine desire to help, but in an attempt to disparage her and defame his ex-wife and portray her in an unfavorable light. Channon was out living her best life post-divorce, and Clay wasn't, so he was bitter and angry. Before and after Channon's murder, Clay inappropriately and unnecessarily spread information about Channon's personal life in an attempt to divert suspicion away from himself. The court also heard the 911 call, which was central to establishing Channon's time of death. The defense used the inadequacy in the police investigation, the 911 call confusion, and a large number of items and evidence that were not tested as a way to create reasonable doubt. 19 loose hairs were collected from Channon's robe, her chest, her abdomen, around her pelvic area, the massager box, and the plug end of the massager, and they all failed to be tested. There were other items that were not tested, including the sexual device, the fitted sheet, a towel, and a blood-stained mattress protector. The defense was also critical of the YSTR testing being conducted and not mitochondrial DNA testing, which is said to be more discriminating. Unfortunately, the failure to test these things was not an oversight, it was actually because of a lack of funding. They determined that the most probative and timely evidence on Channon's neck, face, and under her nails was to be tested because it was the most important. Unfortunately, some of the samples that were tested were used up in their entirety, making it impossible for the defense to retest them. The defense called around 20 witnesses, arguing that the investigation wasn't thorough, because the defense was unable to explain how or why Clay's DNA was found in key incriminating places, like under Channon's fingernails, where only the killer's DNA would have been found. Their arguments didn't exactly benefit Clay's defense, but Clay took the stand in his own defense. He now changed his story about walking to and from his broken-down vehicle on the day of the murder. He testified that he didn't recall detectives saying where he walked, only that he remembered showing them where his car stalled. He also denied being a jealous person. However, this contradicted the testimony he gave about wanting to spy on Channon via the spyware application that he put on her computer. His claim was that he just wanted to make sure his children were safe, and that's why he wanted to look into what she was doing in her private life. All of Channon's children testified, including Austin and 12-year-old Marshall, who both told the court their dad's vehicle was known to be unreliable. Marshall also testified to seeing his dad come home at 4 p.m. the day in question, with oil on his hands from working on his car. They also said their dad took naps all the time during the day to deal with his back pain. In closing, both the prosecution and the defense relied on the DNA evidence. The defense pointed to the failure to specifically identify Clay as a sole DNA contributor. The prosecution, however, pointed out that even if all the items and evidence were tested, another DNA found still didn't exclude or explain why Clay's DNA was present in the places it was. On May 28th, the jury found Clay guilty of both charges, with 4 of the 5 aggravating factors present. Most of the jurors felt Clay was guilty right from the beginning. His lack of a solid alibi and his DNA being found under Channon's fingernails was just too compelling. Outside the court, Channon's mom, Melanie, who was open about the fact that she believed Clay had brainwashed the children into believing he was innocent, spoke of how relieved she was. But she had tremendous sadness, saying that today is a little bit of closure, but I don't have my daughter back. There will always be an empty hole in my heart. If she was going to date, more power to her. At least she had a life. She never had a life with him. At Clay's sentencing on July 19th, multiple people from both sides addressed the court. Clay's family, including his children, were adamant that their father had been wrongly convicted and that the real killer was still walking free. Channon's mom, Melanie, told Clay, "You are a cowardly, murdering psychopath and a spineless creature. I hate you with every cell in my body for what you did to my precious daughter. Channon's life mattered. You robbed her kids of their mother. You ripped the heart out of my family." Clay received the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the 3 youngest Starbuck children, the no-contact order would remain in place. At the prosecution's request, Clay would be prohibited from having any contact with Logan, Serena, and Marshall until he passed a mental evaluation with the Department of Corrections or when the children turned 18. Of course, Clay tried to appeal, but on June 25, 2015, his conviction and sentence were upheld by the court. However, 6 years later, in June 2021, the Superior Court decided to allow a new post-conviction testing of the crime scene evidence that was not included the first time, like the hairs, the mattress protector, the washcloth, the robe, the fitted sheet, the towel, and the sexual device. The judge also ordered repeat testing on the massager box, the swabs of Channon's body, and her fingernail clippings. But the pain wasn't over for her children or her family. 6 months later, on December 18, 2021, Channon's third child, 25-year-old Logan, disappeared from Washington after boarding a bus. You'll recall that Logan was on the autism spectrum. As an adult, with their father now in prison and their mother's murder, Logan had a caretaker. Logan had grown into a driven young person who had achieved their goal of living independently in their own apartment. He was determined to prove everyone wrong about being unable to do things themselves. Although it took him multiple attempts, he paid to undergo driver's education and was thrilled when he got his license. Logan was designated female at birth, but in the spring of 2021, he commenced hormone treatment as part of his journey to transition. Logan also began using he and him pronouns on social media, with gender reassignment surgery as his ultimate goal. By the end of 2021, Logan had hit a rough patch in his life. He'd been in a few minor car accidents and was pursued for $4,000 in insurance. As a result, his license had been suspended. He was also dealing with the pain of a recent breakup. To top it off, he lost his job that November due to not being able to get himself there because of his license issues. On the day that Logan went missing, he didn't take a bag and was wearing shorts in freezing cold weather. Soon after his disappearance, authorities found his beanie containing his wallet, phone, keys, and earbuds in Riverside Park. Logan had plans to meet his caretaker on December 20th, but no one could get a hold of him. His car was at his apartment, the lights were off, and there was no answer. The last person believed to have contact with him was his ex. Just 7.5 weeks later, there was news, and it was the worst that you could imagine. On February 10, 2022, a 911 call came in reporting a sighting of a body. Logan's remains were recovered from the river. He had taken his own life. The pain and anguish that this family has had to go through were unbelievable, and I am so sorry. The outcome of that post-conviction testing in Channon's case is not clear. The 59-year-old Clay continues to reside at the Airway Heights Correctional Center in Washington. Since Clay's incarceration, several heated fights have broken out between Channon's family and Clay's family on a Facebook group that's supporting Clay's release from prison, including arguments between Channon's children and their grandmother, Melanie. The group is filled with pictures of the Starbuck children visiting their father and fighting for his release. Sometimes even Clay shares his thoughts on this page, and the way he talks about Channon does not put him in a good light. Whether he really is innocent or not, there's no reason to talk about the deceased mother of your children in that way. I read all that I could take, and a lot of it is pretty harsh. I thought I would leave you with some words from someone who knew Channon, even though briefly, because I think these words are very powerful and meaningful, from one of the men that Channon had gone out with. It was posted on January 29, 2019, and it read, "I knew Channon briefly before she was murdered. I was among the men she dated the month before she died. We shared lunch once and went to an art museum on another occasion. We never had sex, just a couple of nice times, talking and eating and looking at paintings. Mostly, we talked about our respective children and our failed marriages. I never met Clay, but Channon certainly feared him. She explicitly said she thought he would harm her, and she related numerous stories about the way he controlled her and manipulated their children. I believe everything she told me. She struck me as a lady of the finest caliber, smart, artistic, articulate, a devoted mother who wanted to establish her own independent life. She had absolutely beautiful eyes like I've never seen before, and I will never forget them as long as I live. Some people paint her as a harlot, but I was one of her allegedly numerous online acquaintances, and never, in my experience, did she behave as anything other than a beautiful, classy lady. I treated her respectfully, as a grown gentleman should. Granted, I only know what Channon revealed of herself to me over a very short time. I'm extremely sad that she was murdered and suffered as she did when she was attacked. I also feel very sad for her 5 children, whom I know she loved more than anything in this world. Channon was a beautiful person inside and out. Anyone who says otherwise couldn't have personally known her. Rest in peace, Channon.